welcome back to day 2 of the VicWater Annual Conference. I'm Pete Morison, I'm the CEO of VicWater, and it is an absolute pleasure to be your MC for today's sessions. Firstly, I acknowledge the traditional custodians of the various lands on which we are meeting today and the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people participating in this conference. I'd like to pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and recognise and celebrate the diversity of Aboriginal peoples and their ongoing cultures and connections to the lands and waters of Victoria. I'd like to just go through a few simple housekeeping guidelines for you to note. Firstly, today we're using Webinar Jam as our online platform, and to get the best possible connection, please ensure you close all unnecessary apps that you have open and running on your computer. And if you've got people like me with doing homeschooling, etc., hopefully they're not streaming 4K movies or anything like that that's going to put a strain on your internet connection. Now, if you do struggle with interconnection this morning, you can try pressing the reconnect button, which is at the top of the center of your screen, or use the chat function to let us know that you're having issues. There'll be a Q&A session at the end of each presentation, and to ask a question to the presenter, use the chat function to the right of the screen and simply type in your question. You can toggle the button in the bottom right between chat and Q&A. I'll be checking the questions and asking the presenters on your behalf as the session moves through. Every session today will be recorded, and a link's going to be provided to you to watch the replay, and they'll be available next week. We have a few short breaks throughout the morning program to allow you time for a quick convenience and refreshment break between the sessions, and the conference will be concluding at 12:35 p.m. I'd also like to acknowledge the generous support of our conference sponsors. Vision Super, give them special thanks as our official partners for 2020, Amazon Web Services, who are our major sponsors, IOTA, Ashurst and WaterAid being our charity partner. Now, if we took ourselves back to this time last year, would we have ever believed that we'd be experiencing the circumstances we are currently facing? Of course, what's going on now is grist to the mill for media, and sifting out what is true and accurate is indeed challenging. Fortunately, we have independent think tanks like the Grattan Institute to help us make sense of this world, this crazy world, where we might be headed and how we're likely going to get there. So it is my absolute pleasure to introduce to you the CEO of the Grattan Institute, Danielle Wood. Danielle is a leading economist who has published extensively on economic reform priorities, budget policy, tax reform, generational inequality, and reforming political institutions. She is a sought-after media commentator and speaker on policy issues, and indeed, over the last so many months, I have seen so much of the Grattan Institute on the media, which has been fantastic. Danielle is also the National President of the Economic Society of Australia and co-founder and former chair of the Women in Economics Network. Danielle will be sharing her organisation's collective wisdom on the emerging macro trends that impact on us and our sector. So welcome, Danielle.
Thank you very much for that introduction, Peter, and thank you everyone for having me today. As Peter's foreshadowed, I am going to take a very sort of big picture view on, what does the next 12 to 18 months hold? My background is economics, so I will focus using an economics lens, but really I want to drill down into, what does this mean for households? What does it mean for business? And what does it mean for the really big decisions that government are going to be taking over the next couple of years? So the way I'm going to structure it is I'm going to start by talking about health, because what I've learned in this crisis is the health situation and the economic situation inextricably linked. So we really can't talk about how things are going to play out without understanding, or at least thinking about what the potential health scenarios might be. I then want to take a quick look in the rearview mirror just to really impress upon you, how unusual this shock has been, both in its speed and its scale. But then look forward and say, what are the most likely scenarios for the next 12 to 18 months? how are things going to evolve, and what are the big decisions that government has to make that could make a real difference to those scenarios. Then I want to get a little bit more granular and talk about some of the interesting transitions that I think are going on in the economy. The shift between sectors. Are we going to see this manufacturing boom that people are talking about? What does immigration mean for economic output in a world where we're just not going to be running the same scale of immigration program as we were pre-COVID? How is this going to change patterns of working? Is work from home going to stick? And what does that mean for where we're working and where we're living? So there's a lot here. It is very high level, but I really look forward to sharing some of those insights and then to drilling down perhaps a bit more in the Q&A after the session. So let me start with the health situation, and it won't be news to anyone on this webinar that we have a very different situation across the country. Victoria very clearly experienced a substantial, in fact much more substantial than the first wave, second wave of the virus. New South Wales and Queensland have had sort of cases bubbling on and in individual outbreaks that they've so far managed to contain, whereas most of the rest of the country has got to the point of 0 active community cases and has largely been able to stay there. As I said at the start, the COVID shock has impacted economies all around the world. No one has, come out of this looking particularly strong, but the countries that have done better, including Australia, have been the ones that have managed to contain the health situation better. So really interesting observation. If you look at the places with really high death rates from the virus, they are the ones that have sustained the biggest economic shocks. Spain, the UK, Italy, France have all performed really poorly, whereas Australia, at least in a relative sense, has done well both on the health and the economic front. And that really comes down to the observation that the virus is impacting the economy regardless of the health strategy. The uncertainty that it creates, the fear of going out, and just the uncertainty about the future is really shifting people's behaviour in a significant way. So many of you might have seen the Sweden-Denmark comparison. They took quite different strategies on the health front. Denmark locked down to try and contain the virus. Sweden is going more with a herd immunity approach and has kept things open. The economic hit has actually been pretty similar across the two countries. In both countries, consumers have really kept their money in their wallet, and you can see quite significant falls in consumption activity. Equally, there's been a lot of studies looking across US states that have adopted different health strategies, and essentially they've found, at least in the short term, you get a similar economic hit. Again, consumers not spending, loss of jobs, all coming about because of the awful uncertainty that this virus has created. In terms of the health situation in Australia, which reflects a lot of places in the world, part of this happens because people shift their behaviour. In a world where they don't feel that the virus is sufficiently under control, when you're riding that wave of cases upwards, we see older people and people that have pre-existing conditions that are at greater risk of catching the virus and having serious side effects, shifting their behaviour. And it is I found it quite remarkable to see, there are 10 million Australians that may fall into that bucket of higher risk of COVID complications. The other really important point, and again, this is something we've seen globally, is that while the virus is not well contained, disadvantaged communities are at particular risk. And we've absolutely seen that in Melbourne's second wave. That's partly because they're less likely to be able to work from home. So people going out and doing those really important essential jobs are often clustered in those communities. And that's overlaid with the fact that you're more likely to be living in crowded housing where it's just more difficult to contain the spread of the virus. So I think there's also a real obligation on societies to look after those communities by keeping the health situation under control. So what's the plan? I'm sure many of us were glued to the press conference last Sunday. I certainly was. The Premier's set out sort of a loose timetable with the goal of getting to 0 active community cases. We've certainly said that we think that is the right goal. We don't necessarily agree with all aspects of the plan, but we hope that it will give us the best chance of being able to reopen safely and get us back to something closer to business as usual over the next 12 to 18 months, and hopefully get those state borders open again as well. So that is the health situation. Let me turn now to the economic hit. And this just gives you a sense of how significant this has really been. We've been collecting quarterly GDP figures since 1959, and the hit that we saw in the June quarter this year was more than 3 times the biggest hit that we had seen in any time since we've been collecting this data. Annual GDP figures go back longer, and that really highlighted this is the biggest economic shock since the Great Depression, the biggest single year fall in GDP since 1930. And the other thing that's unusual about this shock is just how broad-based it's been in terms of business activity. If we go back to April, there was virtually no sector in the economy, but I would say utilities is one of the rare exceptions where at least 50% of the firms had not experienced a shock to demand. So in almost every other sector, you've got more than half of businesses saying that they'd already experienced a hit to their demand. In what I call the sort of the frontline sectors, those businesses that were really immediately hit by the shutdown, so things like the arts sector, hospitality, parts of manufacturing, that was about 80% of businesses. And in hospitality and the arts, we know they lost more than 20% of output in a 3-month period. So it is an incredibly significant shock in both its scale but also its breadth. We'll see the same thing in terms of unemployment, and of course, unemployment is the human toll from a recession. This is the outcome that we all desperately want to avoid, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about how we avoid it in the long term in a moment. But more than 1 million Australians have lost jobs since this recession began. We've had more than 1.1 million lose hours. So we also have a big underemployment problem as well as unemployment problem. Very different skew of job losses across sectors. We do see some sectors that have been largely insulated. So again, utilities falls into that group, but public administration, finance, insurance, health and social care, if anything, have put on small numbers of jobs during the crisis. But at the other end of the spectrum, accommodation and food services, arts and recreation have shed 15 up to 20% of jobs. That has also fed into what's been a real crisis for young people. So young people always fare worse in recessions. They're the biggest pool of job seekers. So when the jobs dry up, that hits young people particularly hard. And that's been exacerbated in this crisis by the fact that the industries that have been hardest hit, again, accommodation, food services, arts and recreation, are big employers of young people. So anything that we talk about in terms of recovery over the next 12 to 18 months really needs to keep young people and youth jobs front of mind. Which leads me to where we were back in the midst of the crisis, was that when people are losing jobs and hours, they're losing incomes, they still have their outgoings. We're still thinking about how they pay the mortgage, how they pay the rent, how they pay the bills. And really strikingly, a lot of people do not have significant savings in order to manage that type of economic shock. So 50% of households in Australia have savings, which includes offset balances for mortgage accounts of less than 7,000. 30% have less than 1,600. So we were in quite a perilous situation given the very quick hit to employment, and all of us will remember those dreadful pictures of the big queues snaking outside Centrelink offices in a world where a lot of households had very little financial buffer. So it was incumbent on governments to act. This is exactly what we want them to be doing in this kind of economic shock. The idea being when you have a sharp shock, you should be trying to spread the cost of that over time. Governments use their balance sheet to absorb the cost and spread it over time, as well as it's effectively an insurance role. We're trying to spread the costs across the community. Nobody brought COVID on, but the fact is that certain groups were hit much harder, and we've already talked about young people. There was also disproportionately hit low-income jobs, and what we want to do is use government intervention to try and spread that cost. And as I'm going to come to, I think the government has done that relatively effectively to date. So when I think about the response to coronavirus, I really think about it in 3 stages. First is that rescue phase, which is essentially the phase that I've been talking about, the world in which a lot of the economy was shut down either by government restrictions or people modifying their behaviour. The priority was getting cash into the hands of households and businesses to keep them afloat. The next phase, though, looks different. What I'm calling the recovery phase, which I really do think about as the next 12 to 18 months. Probably a lot of Australia is already there. This is where we see Victoria heading in the next few months. Things have opened up again, and we're looking at how do we rebuild the economy, how do we create jobs and economic activity to get us back on track. And then the final phase is the rebuild phase, which is more about substantial long-term reforms to boost the productive capacity of the economy. Of course, the real life is not quite as neat as that, and we've moved back perhaps from recovery to rescue, and there'll be some blending of rebuild and recovery. But I think it does provide sort of a useful framework for thinking about the different types of challenges and the different types of government responses we might expect to see at different phases. So the response to date has been unprecedented in terms of its scale, and that word keeps coming up in the context of this crisis. But in a lot of ways, it's really apt. In terms of the fiscal response, government's taking a very big budget hit. This is the Commonwealth government in the next financial year, largely because of the spending response. Some of that is a reduction in revenue, but the vast bulk of it is the spending response in response to the crisis, and you can see it certainly dwarfs anything that happened in response to the GFC. The budget deficit will be more than 2 times as large as a share of the economy at the end of next financial year. And when you look at the spending, it's $174 billion in direct fiscal supports from the Commonwealth government to deal with the fallout from this virus. So it's certainly not a number that I ever expected to see in my career. The centrepiece was that JobKeeper package. It is, a very significant government intervention. I think in terms of its high-level design principles, it was designed really well, particularly when you think about the very tight time frame for turning that around. It provided, substantial buffers and income supports for households when people had lost jobs or hours. It kept people connected to employers, which is so important for the recovery. The fact that when businesses open again, you want them to have their employees there ready to go. And really one of the aspects of the scheme that was different in Australia compared to a lot of other countries was that it was also a wage subsidy. So it didn't just pay workers when they were at home and stood down during the shutdowns. It's still paying workers now when they're back at work. And what that means is that businesses actually had an incentive to find innovative ways to keep their doors open. So, the cafe that shifted to takeaway, or doing online cooking classes, your local gym doing online personal training sessions, all of that was underpinned by having a scheme like JobKeeper that also facilitated or worked as a wage subsidy. Interestingly, despite the very significant spend by the Australian government, we actually are towards the bottom of the pack of developed countries in terms of the total fiscal response. Early on, when we announced the JobKeeper scheme, we were right at the top of the pack, just behind US, but since then, a lot of other countries have announced a range of other programs. So, even though it is big, put in an international context, there are people doing even more, and I want to come back to some of the even more and what that might look like in a moment. I also don't want to forget the states in this. They have also made big contributions, particularly around things like payroll tax supports, cash injections for small businesses. States have been playing an active role, and most states have spent somewhere between 1% and 2% of GSP in supporting businesses and households through the crisis. We've seen some of the cooperative federalism break down in recent times, and one of the criticisms the Commonwealth government has levied is that the states haven't done their share of the heavy lifting. There is an element of truth in that, even when you do adjust for the fact that states have far less revenue raising capacity for the Commonwealth the Commonwealth contribution has been substantially larger. So I think there is a interesting question in the recovery phase about who does what, but as I'm going to come to, our basic conclusion is that both levels of government need to do more. The other thing about the government response, which I think is less well understood, is just because of the sheer scale of it, it has been very effective at supporting incomes in the short term. So even though wages and salary incomes fell over the period, overall incomes rose because of the increase in benefits. And there were sizable groups of people that didn't just maintain their incomes, but saw an increase in their incomes. So anyone who was already on unemployment benefits on the old New Start saw a big increase because of the effective doubling of that rate of support. We had other groups of income recipients like pensioners getting stimulus checks, so it was a boost to their income. There are a lot of part-time workers that are on JobKeeper that, because that was a flat payment, actually saw an increase in their incomes. And I think in a lot of ways that has masked the feeling of recession. So while anyone who's lost jobs or hours, it feels they're absolutely feeling it. For others, I think it doesn't perhaps feel as acute as we might expect because of that huge cash influx from governments. Ditto for businesses. A lot of businesses struggling, but we haven't seen mass insolvencies yet. We've actually had a lower rate of insolvencies this year than we have in previous years. That's partly because of the changes to insolvency laws, and it's largely because of the cash flow supports that have existed. Yet these things can't last forever. And as I want to come to, that is really why the next phase of this crisis will be challenging. And I think the lived experience of the crisis will start to be quite different as these supports start to get withdrawn. So something that was interesting early on is as we rolled all these things out really quickly, these big programs, everyone had this sort of 6-month date in mind. And you remember we were talking about, essentially this is going to be a 6-month crisis and then it would end. And what that meant is all the programs effectively were coming off at the same time. So, the big JobKeeper, job seeker supports all coming off at the end of September. A lot of the state tax relief schemes were tied to those, so they were also coming off at the end of September. The moratorium on tenancy evictions, the commercial rental code of conduct, the corporation law amendment, the bank repayment holidays, all essentially scheduled to come off at the same time. So I was sort of been out there very actively talking about this concern that you can't just kind of turn off the tap hard, and this is the terminology around the fiscal cliff. This idea that we were pumping all this money into the economy and then that hard turn off would really see a significant drop. Governments, to be fair, have responded to those concerns. We are seeing more slow transitions off some of the major programs. So, for example, JobKeeper and Job Seeker will now transition off more slowly. There have been some additional programs announced. Some of those loan repayment schemes, banks are going to find a way to transition off. So we're not just going to dump households that haven't had their income recovered off the repayment programs. But there will still be a significant drop in government support in government support to the economy come October. So we are still going from a world where fiscal supports are averaging about $18 billion a month on average to averaging about $5 billion a month. So it is a very significant drop-off, and private sector activity is not yet strong enough to fill that gap. So the big question that I want to pose today is, what should support look like in the next phase? What is the broader economic trends going to look like? I'll say it again because it's such an important point. Obviously, it depends crucially on the health situation, and that's something that is very difficult to predict. I think the best case scenario is if we're able to achieve the goal of zero community transition, open up more confidently, that would be, perhaps the best we can expect until we get either a vaccine or an effective treatment for COVID. Worst case scenario is we continue to see waves and opening and reopening, which would be absolutely devastating, I think, for everyone's state of mind, and certainly devastating for confidence. But even let's assume we come out at the better end of that spectrum, we will be a long way from business as usual. Of course, we're in the middle of a globally synchronised recession, and as a major trading nation, that comes with its own toll on economic activity in Australia. I think almost certainly there will remain some social distancing requirements for hospitality businesses, for personal services businesses, and that means that some of those businesses will just be operating below capacity, and some will not be able to survive that. International travel probably is still a long way off, unfortunately, and I want to come to in a minute to the impact on migration. But the real concern, I think, in this next phase, in this next 12 to 18 months, is how these second round effects play out. Consumer and business uncertainty has been all over the shop in this crisis, but my concern is, as we see these supports start to come off, that uncertainty comes again to the fore. People stop spending, businesses stop investing, and we don't get the recovery that we really need. That is going to be exacerbated by debt overhang, and what I mean by that is, even though they've called these things loan repayment holidays, essentially they're deferrals. That interest is still being accrued. So on the other side of this, households and businesses will have bigger bills in terms of managing their loan repayments. A lot of businesses have deferred rents, and that starts to having to get paid back, and all of that is reducing spending power in the economy over the next 12 months. So I certainly expect more vulnerable consumers, and in your line of work, that probably means more hardship in order to deal with. As those government income supports come off, more people are going to be struggling to meet those day-to-day expenses. So I expect there will be a group that will be struggling, that will be looking for various supports in order to continue to pay their bills. And certainly we're going to see more insolvencies. Really it has been masked, as I said, by the government supports and the insolvency law changes. I know a lot of insolvency specialists that are really gearing up for a very big 2021. So in that way, I think recession will seem more real when you start to see those businesses closing their doors. Peter asked me an interesting question when we were chatting before this presentation about, what will it mean for regulatory appetite for price increases. And, I do think it becomes harder in a world where, we're feeling the recession, where a lot of people will have seen their income fall back, where businesses are closing to be pushing for increases in prices. And we know that across the economy, probably wages and prices are going to be subdued for an extended period. The other point I want to come back to, because as I said, unemployment is really what we should be worried about here. It is the human toll of an economic crisis. Is that you might have heard the expression, it goes up the lift and down the stairs. So unemployment tends to take a lot longer to come down than it does to go up. And in fact, if we look back at those previous crises, Great Depression, the 80s, 90s recessions, the GFC, tends to take about 2 to 3 times as long to come down as it does to go up. And in line with that, some of the forecasts for the economy as a whole are not particularly cheery. So these are some numbers from the Parliamentary Budget Office. They're forecasting that the economy will continue to run below potential, which is a polite way of saying that we're not using our labour and capital resources as much as we could be, to at least 2028. So almost a decade of the economy running below what it could be. That is something that I don't think we should accept. There is things that government can do here that will substantially improve these outcomes. If we look at forecasts for GDP and unemployment, at the moment the Reserve Bank says that we're not going to be back to our pre-COVID level of activity by the end of next year. Unemployment will continue to rise to hit 10% by the end of this year, but still be at 8.5% by the end of next year. That is really what concerns me. That is too high for too long. We know so much about the impacts of unemployment on individuals. There's a huge economics literature on this point, but the point is, extended periods of unemployment, not necessarily short periods, but extended periods, as you often get in recessions, lead to a world where those individuals have poorer work prospects and outcomes in terms of their likelihood of being employed, in terms of their wages growth, not just during the recession, but 2 years, 5 years, even up to a decade later. So this is something that we absolutely should be trying to avoid at all costs. The other really interesting literature that's coming about now is more about the macroeconomic effects of running your economy below potential for an extended period. And what that shows is it actually impacts your longer term growth. So improvements in living standards over time, well, on the other side of this, could be impacted if we sit there below potential for too long. And that happens because things like your human capital, the great investments that we've made in the potential of our people, start to degrade in a world where you're not using those skills as fully as you could be. So what should happen? In past recessions, we've been really reliant on monetary policy. So effectively, Reserve Bank dropping the interest rate to get cash moving in the economy and get activity moving again. That is not a tool that we will be able to rely on as much this time around. The cash rate is as close as it can be to the zero lower bound. That's not to say there is nothing that the Reserve Bank can't do, and it is doing some things in the unconventional space, you know, buying corporate bonds, buying government bonds, trying to keep borrowing costs low. It could be doing more of that, and in fact, most overseas equivalents are doing more in that space. So we think there is a bigger role for the Reserve Bank, but it is limited, and largely this means it's going to come back on government and fiscal policy. So can governments impact unemployment? Absolutely, yes. Fiscal stimulus, and there are many different forms that can take. That can be spending, it can be investments, it can be tax cuts, can generate economic activity, can create jobs and bring down unemployment. So, you know, we argue that a fiscal stimulus package should be focused on trying to bring unemployment back down to something closer to full employment, 4 to 5%, over the next 18-month period. How much spending does that involve? You can do various calculations involving depending what you think the fiscal multipliers are, but where we come out is probably in the vicinity of $100 to $120 billion. So it's less than the government spent so far on fiscal supports, but still a sizable intervention. But we think the payoffs are absolutely there. The risks of not doing enough are much greater than the risks of doing too much in this space. So I want to talk about what that might look like. And, you know, I think there'll be a number of different aspects to any package. It should really be focused on money that is going to create jobs and money that's going to create things of social value. So that probably means that we keep JobKeeper and JobSeeker payment rates where they are, rather than phasing down post-September for the rest of the year. I do think the idea of better targeting of JobKeeper is a good one. So the government's policy that they retest eligibility. Some businesses have recovered, so they should come off the payments. They are emergency payments. But for those businesses that haven't recovered, and a lot of those will be in Victoria because of the second wave of the virus, it doesn't make a lot of sense to transition those payments down just yet. A traditional form of stimulus, and one that we absolutely should do here, is infrastructure investment to support the construction sector. It is a big employer. It takes a big hit during economic downturns. We should focus on shovel-ready projects, things that we can roll out quickly, because we need to remember we need to be front-end loading this stimulus. It needs to be hitting the economy come October, when we know that slump is going to happen. So you would have probably heard a lot of people talking about the importance of social housing construction. It does make a lot of sense. It employs very similar people to those that would be in the downturn sectors, which is largely around apartment construction in inner cities. It obviously meets a huge social need, and we have a massive shortage of social housing. But there's also other shovel-ready things you can do to get a good regional split of projects. So things like road and building maintenance, sustainability retrofits of public buildings to improve their green credentials and save money going forward. But I think really important to note about this recession, and it does look a little bit different in other recessions in this regard, is this is not just hitting tradies and construction sector. It has actually been services sectors that have been hit hardest, and a lot of women and a lot of young people have lost jobs. So we need to think about interventions in a much broader sense. So we certainly think there's an important role for government services spending here, really targeting social needs that have emerged during COVID. So spending on mental health services, on aged care services. We've observed that disadvantaged students have been falling behind because of remote learning. Rolling out intensive tutoring programs helps create jobs for teachers that are graduating from school and have got really poor job outcomes at the moment, as well as helping those students catch up and providing long-term benefits for society. Of course, private sector has a really important role to play in the recovery as well, and there are various things that governments can do to help private sector get back on its feet. So after the JobKeeper scheme finishes, and it will need to finish, it is an emergency support scheme, looking at other ways in which you can help stimulate employment, so things like hiring bonuses could play a role post the wind up of that scheme. Payroll tax cuts in terms of state governments, investment allowances to try and encourage greater investment in capital assets. But I think there will need to be more, and particularly when I think about those sectors that have been hardest hit, hospitality, the arts, tourism. It's difficult to get into those sectors in terms of traditional stimulus. They are private sector. They're not areas where government normally plays a role. So you can do things like tax cuts, personal income tax cuts. The issue is, in a world where you have a lot of uncertainty, a lot of that money ends up getting saved rather than spent. So your bang for your buck is relatively low. There are a lot of interesting and creative things happening around the world that is trying to get the money more directly into those sectors. So things like vouchers that say, this is for spending only with tourism operators. The UK has a scheme, Eat Out to Help Out, where government essentially is funding 50% discounts on people going out for dinner to restaurants and pubs, but only on Monday and Wednesday nights to try and spread activity across the week. There are various schemes in play which are encouraging people to support bricks and mortar retail. So I actually think thinking about some of those types of schemes will be really important, and it does allow you to target money to those sectors that need it most and gives you a lot more bang for your buck than tax cuts. Something else that I think will be really important is childcare, and it's been an industry that's had a lot of ups and downs during the COVID crisis. When a lot of parents were pulling their children out, they moved to free childcare briefly, then moved back to full fees and some additional government supports for the sector. But the real concern is as income supports start to come off, a lot of parents will not be able to afford to keep their children in care. That's obviously not great for the children. They benefit from the continuity of care, and it's also really bad for the economic recovery because it reduces the flexibility of parents and particularly mothers to be able to take work as it becomes available again if they leave that care place. So I would also like to see a boost to childcare subsidies to reduce out-of-pocket costs being part of the government response here. And then there are just a couple of things I think that have been on the long-term to-do list that it makes absolute sense to pursue right now. Increasing the permanent rate of the job seeker payment is something that I've never actually seen almost as much consensus from across the political spectrum that this is a good idea. In the years before COVID, I think the case is even more overwhelming now. We need people to be able to survive on that base rate of payment. We need them to be able to, afford to pay their bills, and that's going to help them get the best chance of being job ready on the other side, as well as the fact that we know that that money will make its way back into the economy because when you're living on that level of income, you spend every dollar. So there are plenty of things governments can and should do that I think would give a much better chance of coming out of this crisis strongly. What's holding us back? The concern, of course, is always about debt and the situation that we come out the other side with. I would say a couple of things about that. First of all, as I said earlier, this is a very large, very unusual crisis, and it is absolutely appropriate for governments to be using their balance sheet to manage the crisis and spread the costs over time. We will come out of this with substantially more debt than we went in with. But the other point that really makes me much more relaxed about the manageability of the debt situation is just how low borrowing costs are. Governments can borrow, or the Commonwealth Government can borrow for a decade 0.9% interest. They've been issuing 30-year bonds at 1.9% interest, both below the expected rate of inflation. Essentially, people are paying government to take their money for long periods of time. So it makes absolute sense, and it makes even substantially higher levels of debt very manageable over time. So we've done lots of modelling of debt scenarios, even in a world where we borrow a lot over the next 2 years and then continue to run budget deficits of $50 billion a year, pretty sizable budget deficits for a decade, and growth is pretty lackluster at 4.5%, certainly low by historical standards, essentially where we were running pre-COVID, which was not shooting the lights out anyway. Debt will stabilise as a share of the economy even in those situations. So we just do not need to worry about this kind of debt spiral of growing as a share of the economy over time. So government should have their mind at ease that this is very affordable and manageable and is incredibly important to do. So let me do a bit of a pivot now and talk about some of the more granular aspects of what COVID changes. And I think we are in an interesting transitional period where some of the changes that have been afoot in COVID will be permanent, or at least here for a long time to come. So that has important implications for businesses and for governments in helping these transitions take place. So the first question I wanted to go to was, are we going to see a real shift in supply chains and a boom for local manufacturing? And I think it's worth looking at the history a bit here. Manufacturing sector as an employer in Australia has really been in decline since the 1970s. And you'll see that as jobs in manufacturing declined, the service industries have been ascendant. And services now employ 8 out of 10 Australians, which is a pretty phenomenal figure, but is a very consistent pattern right across the developed world. And as you'll see, manufacturing output as a share of the economy is at the lower end in Australia, but certainly has been in decline right across the OECD. So as countries develop, this tends to be the pattern, the shift from manufacturing to the services sector. And indeed, and even in places like China now, we see a stabilisation and now a decline of jobs as a share of the economy in manufacturing. Will COVID change this? I think the answer on that large macro scale is no. But that doesn't mean there is not some opportunities. I think we will absolutely be revisiting questions of what do we need to be able to produce in the country? What do we just not feel comfortable relying on other countries for? And things like PPE will obviously be part of that conversation. I think there may be some questions about food processing and what do we want to have the capacity to do here. And there's been long-term conversations about kind of high value add manufacturing. But are we going to return to the worlds of massive factories as big employers? I think it would be highly doubtful, and nor do I think it would be a good thing for Australia to try and get back to that place. Migration is something else which will be a really big shift coming out of COVID, and I think will remain a challenge until we get to the point of a vaccine or a treatment. Australia has run a very strong migration program in the past decade, both by historical standards and by the standards of a lot of other developed countries. And when you look at the breakdown of that migration program, there is a perception that we largely run a skilled program. That's certainly an important component of it. But actually, a lot of categories have been relatively low skill in recent years, and particularly the rise of working holiday and student visas have contributed to that. Immigration has accounted for a lot of our headline economic growth. Population growth has been the biggest component of economic growth over the past 6 years, and immigration is 2/3 of that population growth component. So a lot of the sort of Australian economic miracle of the period of uninterrupted growth has been partly underpinned by the fact that we've just had very high levels of population growth. So when you turn that off, that obviously shifts the conversation a lot. A lot of housing discussion, a lot of transport infrastructure discussion, a lot of growth forecasts for consumer-led businesses have been based around this model of relatively high population growth, and that is just not going to be the case until we find a way to bring people in safely. So you can see there what's happened to inbound entries to Australia during COVID. At the moment, the way we're running quarantine, we don't have enough capacity even to get in all the expatriate Australians who want to come back. So we do need to look at how we can boost the capacity of the quarantine system. I think that's a really important point. Obviously, this has to be done safely. But even then, we're just not going to be able to run it at anywhere near the scale at which we had been pre-COVID. That leads to some very difficult, challenging questions for governments about how we actually ration those places. Obviously, it's not a good situation to have Australian expats that can't get back into the country. Some Australians will need to leave, to see sick family members or to go to funerals. They need to get back in. We have universities talking about starting programs to, trialling programs to bring in students. At the same time, there will be skilled shortages that we want to bring in migrants for, seasonal workers that tend to prop up farm output. How do you manage or ration places between those different categories is an incredibly difficult question, I think, that governments are going to have to grapple with sooner rather than later, because putting your head in the sand and pretending that one group is taking places from another group is simply not right in a way you have a really capacity constrained program. Now, flexible work. This is another one where I think the COVID changes are going to see some permanent shifts. So we went from a world before COVID where remote work was relatively unusual. Certainly the majority of Australians were not working remotely at all, or if they were, it was no more than 1 day a week. A lot of survey evidence suggests that has now shifted. There is a greater appetite amongst people to work remotely where that is possible for them. And in fact, a majority expect to be working from home 2 or more days a week in a post-COVID world. So I have done a poll. I've been told I can do polls in this wonderful WebJam world. So if you go to the polls tab, you should be able to see a poll there about your own work habits, and I can see that is getting filled out as we speak in real time. So I'm interested in, do you think you'll be working from home substantially more, a bit more, or no more compared to your pre-COVID situation? And what I can see there, wow, almost everyone so far says they will be working more from home, and a bit of a balance between substantially more and a bit more. So I think it's fair to say the water industry is a lot like a lot of the other professional jobs that we're seeing, where there is a real appetite to do things differently on the other side of this. And I think COVID has shown us that it is possible in order to do this. But most people are still looking at what I'm calling kind of flexi style work, where they expect to be working from home more, certainly more than they were, but they still want to spend some time in the office. And I think that really, poses an interesting question of what does this mean for our CBDs? What does it mean for our other office dense areas? People do want to make an appearance, but they might only be there, 1 day, 2 days, 3 days a week, compared to the full 5 days that they used to work pre-COVID. There are a lot of benefits to face-to-face contact, which I think no matter how good some of these digital platforms are, you just can't replicate online. So it makes sense, I think, this model of flexible work, but it will mean a big shift in demand, I think, for commercial property. We know that people are not going to be keen to be paying for the same amount of space if all of a sudden they only have half as many staff there on any given day of the week. That may be partially offset to some extent by the fact that we will need more space per person while social distancing is in place, but it will mean that office buildings have to perhaps rethink the way in which they structure their offer. So interesting suggestion from Committee of Sydney that we will see retrofitting to put more emphasis on gathering, ideas sharing meetings rather than kind of cubicles for working. That certainly makes sense to me from what I'm hearing when I'm talking to smaller businesses. A lot of them are seeing now that that time in the office will be time where they want to really solidly concentrate on doing the things that have the big spillovers, that face-to-face, the interactions with colleagues, whereas that time at home, they really see as that time for that deep isolated work, which means that, you may only be going all in there a couple of days a week, but working really differently. So that will require a degree of flexibility. Other interesting propositions around, if you have that space, how do you get groups that traditionally were excluded from a lot of those agglomeration and spillover benefits of working in the city by the very high rents? Can you create space for startups, for arts, businesses, for those types of people to come in and help rebuild dynamic cities in a world where there's just less office workers in there? Also, really interesting questions about what this means for where we live and what sort of spaces we live in. So there was a lot of discussion early on in COVID is, are we going to see this kind of mass decentralisation and everyone moving to the country? I think the answer is no, but I think there is an element of that. So certainly I think there is an appetite for greater space and an appreciation of space that people have experienced after lockdown. But if it is right that a lot of people will be pursuing that flexi work model, they're still going to want to be in commuting distance to the CBD. So there was already a trend to people moving out to some of those cities that were reachable by public transport, and I think that will probably continue. I think there will be a premium on inner suburbs. People are going to want to try and get into the CBD without using public transport, as I'm going to come to in a moment, for various reasons. So, distances that you can walk or ride or skate or whatever your thing is will be, I think, at a premium. On the flip side, though, the home office just became a really valuable asset. If you're working from home 2 or 3 days a week, having a space in order to work becomes more important. So I think it will also shift demand for larger properties. And at the same time, the supply may well be drying up, if I'm right, that what was already a trend that older Australians wanted to age in place continues, and older Australians want to stay in their family home for longer. Big challenges on the transport front, I think. Even though most trips to work across Melbourne are via car, that is not true of trips to the CBD. The majority of work trips to the CBD are via public transport. We are just not going to be able to run those transport networks at the capacity that we did pre-COVID, while you have social distancing, which is necessary because we know they are higher risk environments. That will constrain capacity, and I think just a lot of people aren't going to have the appetite for jumping on a crowded train or tram for a long time to come. So even in a world where fewer people are going into the city, if you lose substantial capacity on public transport, you do have the problem of how do you get them in there. So I think in the short term, perhaps temporary parking, not necessarily in the CBD, but on the ring around, and then allowing people to use active transport to get in for the last mile. We have been advocating for congestion charging for cities for a long time. I think that actually becomes even more pressing in this world. What we don't want is those really significant economic, social costs of congestion, because everyone is now trying to drive into work. And in a world where we have greater flexibility in work, we want to encourage people to spread their trips across the day. So only the most high value trips are happening in that peak period. So this is actually really the time to introduce a scheme like that. And finally, greater promotion for active transport. How do we make it easier and a better quality experience for people to cycle in, for people to walk in? And we're seeing a lot of innovation again around the world with this, just putting a lot more cycling infrastructure in place, pedestrianising some of the major streets to make all of this more attractive and easier for people. And finally, I'm going to talk a little bit about innovation in public spaces. I think there's a lot of really interesting, exciting things happening here. In a world with COVID, with social distancing, if we cannot gather indoors in large numbers, we're going to have to find a way to replace some of those experiences that used to be in that environment. On-street seating for bars and dining. There was a big initiative in New York, the open dining initiative. Other places also trialling similar things, and it's something the City of Melbourne is talking about here. They're taking back space, whether it's roads, whether it's bays in car parks, in order to encourage people to eat outdoors. Ditto with retail, pop-ups in car parks, major events, obviously shifting outside, as well as the opportunity for kind of smaller scale arts events to move outdoors. And I've got the outdoor office with a question mark there. I think a lot of businesses thinking about, how do you run big meetings, particularly longer meetings, and whether some of that will start to happen outdoors is an interesting question. So I'm going to leave it there. I do like to, finish on a positive note. And, what I would say is this is obviously, huge, unexpected shock that's, required a lot from our households and businesses and governments, and will continue to do so. But I do think there is evidence that, if we respond at the scale necessary, if we are flexible and adaptable and innovative in thinking about how we manage this with COVID world, we've got the best chance of coming out on the other side strongly. And, I think we all play an important role in that. So thank you very much. I did see a lot of questions coming in, and hopefully Peter's been reading through them all and curating them.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Danielle. So there are many questions, and people were very impressed with your presentation. So thanks so much. Freya's asked a question: when doing comparisons between countries, states that did or did not lock down with similar economic outcomes, what impact has government support had in that? And she assumes that all of those in lockdown had significant support.
That is true. So I think government support has been really important at cushioning the blow, but also fair to say that those that didn't lock down have had to introduce quite significant government supports as well, because of that underlying fact that in a world where the virus is there, you are still getting a big economic shock because people are changing their behaviour. So, parts of the US, Sweden have also had, significant government support programs. So it's not necessarily possible to kind of condition for the scale of that support, but I think it's fair to say that everyone has found the need to inject substantial money into the economy because of the shock from COVID.
Tony mentions mining has had minimum consequences at the time, and considering it's such a great contributor to the Australian economy, what would we expect to see a lagging or a decline in mining as global construction declines? And if so, would this have a second wave effect to our economy?
Yeah, good question. It absolutely has held up, and in fact, the iron ore price has probably been one of the bright spots, and that's large. Well, there's been a couple of factors. One of our major competitors is still essentially out of action because of the dam collapse, but Chinese demand came back quite strongly. And if that chart that I put up right at the very start about economic activity, China was the one that has actually grown its economy, not by much, and certainly nowhere near as much as it was growing pre-COVID. But because it got its health situation under control quickly, its construction activity is essentially back where it was pre-COVID. And I think that will play an important role in supporting demand. But the same won't be true of all of our other customers. So I think we will see an easing off on prices for some of those export materials, and that obviously in itself creates a drag, because that has been an important ballast for the economy in recent months.
Susan asked the question, Susan suspects the timing of the three phases of the COVID response will coincide with the availability of an effective vaccine. If not, how might we be able to achieve herd immunity as such?
That is such a challenging question, and I think almost everything that I've said, and I think almost all the planning that's gone on, has assumed that there will be not necessarily a vaccine, also a treatment. And I think in a way maybe treatment is more promising given what we know about time lags for vaccines. If we don't get to that world, we're in a very different place. What I would say is no country, even Sweden, that has effectively not introduced strict public health measures, is anywhere close to herd immunity. We know from antigen testing, they may have only seen 5% of their population infected. So it is a long road to get there. It is one that we don't want to go down, I think, because of what we said about the impact of a world where the virus is running uncontained. I mean, obviously the big human costs in terms of deaths and poor health outcomes, but big economic costs of that as well. So I think we have to be hopeful that there is some type of effective vaccine or treatment. I'm personally sceptical about a lot of the assumptions that's going to be mid next year. I think it is longer, but we've got to work out how we manage in that transition period.
Yes. Carolyn has asked you to comment on access to super decision of government and its impact on our current situation and people going forward.
Yeah, look, that's a tricky one. So the government made a decision that one way to help people would be to allow them to have early access to super. It has been another one of the sort of significant supports for household income. So, when we're talking about the size of the response, the amount withdrawn is adds about 1.5% of GDP to that 10% fiscal response. So, it's been actually a significant ballast. I'm not against the decision, but I don't think it was necessarily implemented particularly well. So I think the idea that, when you have experienced such a big shock and you're struggling to pay the bills, that you could be able to access your super is not a crazy proposition. But what we do know is that some people were accessing it when they weren't necessarily suffering a hit to their income, which is obviously kind of undermining the idea of compulsory super, which is to encourage people to save for their retirement. So I think it should have been more tightly controlled so that only those that really needed it were able to access it. It will mean, of course, a hit to retirement incomes for people that did do that. But what we found is that might not be as significant as a lot of people realise. Most people will end up on some combination of part pension and super in retirement. If your super balance goes down, it means you'll get a bit more part pension. So the overall hit on incomes in retirement might not be as large as some of the super industry numbers suggest.
Jacinta's interested in your comments about, given you mentioned a lot about the impact on youth, she's curious about the impact on gender, noting in her region there's been a major impact on women as a result of COVID-19.
Yeah, so that's right. And particularly in the that initial shutdown phase, women actually did lose jobs faster and lost more hours than men. As things have reopened, so this is sort of talking more about Australia rather than Victoria, because obviously we're in quite a different place, but as things reopened, that was partly addressed. So women's jobs came back more quickly. So now if you look across Australia, job losses and hour losses are quite similar between men and women. But what I would say is a lot of our traditional responses for dealing with recessions and stimulus are very male-focused in their nature. So when we've had big shocks for women as well, we do need to think not just about construction and almost all the genuine stimulus parts of the state government and federal government package at the moment are construction-focused. It's important, as I said, I think we absolutely should support that industry, but we need to think more broadly if we're going to support women's jobs. And my point about childcare comes in there as well. Women have taken up a disproportionate share of the additional caring duties that have come out in COVID with homeschooling and childcare closures. So supporting them to get back into the workforce through making childcare accessible and affordable is going to be incredibly important.
I'll ask one last question, although there are many, Danielle, a great deal of interest here. Do you think Victoria will gain its historic position in its contribution to the Australian economy?
I think not in the short term. I think this has been a substantial additional hit to Victoria. A huge part of Victoria's contribution is in CBD economy, and that's just not going to come back, I think, anytime in the next year. So I think it will be a slow rebuild. Do I think we can get there in the longer term? Yes, absolutely. But I think, in the period that I'm talking about in the next year or two, I think Victorians' economy will be hurting for longer than the rest of the country, unfortunately.
Well, I think on that note, we'll leave it. The chat attests that this has been an excellent presentation. Thank you, Danielle. We've very much enjoyed having you with us today and for sharing your insights with us. There's a long haul ahead for us, but you've made some very good suggestions as to how we can address some of these challenges. So thank you so much.
Fantastic. Thanks for having me, and thank you for all those excellent questions that are coming in.
All right, everyone. We're going to take a short break and be back promptly at 10:10. Thank you very much. Good morning. Well, welcome back, everyone. We are going to shift down scale just a tiny little bit, because we're going to now look at matters of livability. And I'd like to introduce to you Professor Billie Giles-Corti to talk about creating a healthy, livable Melbourne for all. Now, Billie is a distinguished professor and director of Urban Futures, an AV capability platform at RMIT University, as well as a director of the Healthy Livable Cities Group at the Centre for Urban Research. Her role at RMIT is to bring together multidisciplinary teams to solve complex urban problems. Billie is also a colleague member of mine on Melbourne Water's Livability Directions panel, so she's understanding a lot about our water sector as part of that role. So welcome, Billie. Look forward to hearing your presentation.
Thank you, Peter. Can you hear me? You can.
Yes.
Okay, great. Well, thanks so much for the invitation to talk to you today. I'm going to be talking to you about Healthy Livable Melbourne, and just to explore how we're tracking. This is a piece of work that we've been doing now since 2011, and so it's exciting for me to be able to share to you where we've got up to, and it's very relevant in the COVID discussions, because I think for those of you probably will agree that if you lived in an environment which was a livable neighbourhood, it made it a lot easier to manage during the COVID experience. If you had a local park and you had all the sort of facilities that you needed nearby, it made it a lot easier to manage during COVID than if you had to drive somewhere or you had to travel a lot. So really the sorts of things I'm going to be talking about are very consistent with your previous speaker, Danielle, in terms of what we need in the future. Now, in terms of, before I start, I should acknowledge the traditional owners on the lands of which we're all meeting. I don't know, you must be across the country or across the state, but I do acknowledge elders past and present, and in particular for their stewardship and custodianship of the land of which we're all meeting on. In terms of city planning and health, it's really become like a global acknowledgement now that this is really critical for health and well-being. And the UN Sustainable Development Goals include 9 goals, 24 targets around city planning and health. So it's recognised by the Sustainable Development Goals. In 2016, the World Health Organization emphasised, for decades it's had a focus on the importance of creating healthy cities. But what they emphasised was that cities are critical settings for health, and that we should be using health as one of the markers of any city's successful sustainable development. So the health sector is very interested in sustainability. There's also recognition by World Health Organization that the importance of creating active cities where people can be physically active. That includes creating, encouraging people to be active, creating healthy environments or active environments, but also creating systems that support activity. And Danielle was talking about the need to encourage cycling. I can't emphasize how important that is from a health perspective. I should just say, if there's one thing that you can do for your health, which is really the best thing, and it's been amazing during COVID just how much this has been emphasized, is to be physically active. It is really like the magic bullet. It really is in terms of health and well-being. So I think these are all really important. But I think really in terms of the biggest threat to human health, which we are in the health sector now really being alert to and really taking on, is climate change. Now, there is no question that climate change, as we saw last summer, is going to have a massive impact on health and well-being, both practically, smoke inhalation, but also in terms of infectious disease, because there will be a change in the infectious diseases. And in fact, there's a lot of argument that the way we've developed our communities is partly why we will get more pandemics and more health problems in the future, because we are changing the habitat of different types of species, which actually contribute to some of the problems that we're seeing in terms of infectious diseases. So climate change is a really huge problem. And I don't know about you, but for me, when I came back from summer holidays in Perth, we had our hottest year on record, 1.5 degrees hotter than ever before. 7 million hectares of Australia was on fire. That was really disturbing, and it really felt like we were in an inferno. 1,500 houses being lost, and the loss of habitat for animals and loss of animals was really quite a shocking start to the year, and it's only been compounded by COVID. But we can't forget that a primary thing that we need to be thinking about is sustainability, that we need to be creating a more sustainable future. In my mind, there's no question we have a climate emergency and that we really need to be moving fast. And this has been recognised by the World Health Organization as putting out now its global strategy on health, the environment and climate change, in recognition that health and well-being will be markedly affected if we are not able to do that. And it ties very much to livability. Now, I don't know about you, if you've got children or young people in your household, I, as an older person, look at this and think, I really do need to do something to contribute to the debate. We've got young people who are really asking us, what are you doing? What have you done on your watch to contribute? Now, it's interesting, actually, in my own area, I've been doing work in this area for a very long time, and my PhD was working in 96, and it's the wisdom of crowds. You ask people, I did focus groups, I asked people, what would you do if you were a developer designing a community that you wanted people to be physically and socially, a community actually that would be more sustainable, what would you include? And the sorts of things I'm going to be talking to you about are all the things that in 1996, people were saying this is what's needed to create a healthy, livable community. Nothing has changed. What is disturbing is that we haven't moved quickly enough. People know what we need. The question is, how do we create it? Now, we all get very excited about the Economist Intelligence Unit, and I know, we lost our mantle a couple of years ago to Vienna, but it's really important to know that and it's just about to be released shortly, as I understand it, the Economist Intelligence Unit, its indicators for livability, a livable community, are not the sorts of things that affect the daily lives of people living in a community. So, for example, in terms of climate and culture and health, the sorts of things that it is measuring are things like, what's the temperature like? Is it uncomfortable for travellers to travel? What's the level of corruption? I'm not saying these things are not important. And they're sort of fairly qualitative. They're not quantitative. They tell you nothing about the distribution of amenities across a city. They are really, what this index is for, is to try and identify what executives should receive. Should they receive a loading when they get transferred to a country? And if you look at the detail, in some countries executives get a 20% loading, and of course the places that they're going to live in Melbourne will be very livable because that's where executives live, but they don't get a loading when they come to Melbourne. That's the bottom line, because it is very livable by global standards. But this tells us nothing about the livability of a city for the people who live in a city. when I came to Melbourne in 2011, the health department was very concerned about the rapid growth that was going on across the city. It was the Northwest region was dealing with 4 of the 6 growth areas, and they asked me to get involved because the problems that they were experiencing were massive. Domestic violence, alcohol consumption, lack of jobs, that sort of thing. They asked me to get involved, and I went around and I interviewed all the local government authorities, all the CEOs, and all the state government regional managers, all the CEOs of or the Director Generals of the major government departments, to find out what they could do to contribute to the health and well-being of people in the region. And what was interesting for me is that without even me prompting them, what they said is that in our area, we can't. The only way we can promote health is if we deal with the sort of underlying causes of ill health, and we need. A lot of people living in these new areas have no jobs. They don't have enough public open space, so it's very hot in the summer. They don't have. They don't have public transport. There's lots of things they don't have, and as a consequence of that, that is affecting their health. So I sort of rethought this, and to me, as a health person, a public health academic, and we've seen the importance of evidence during the COVID experience. You can just see how public health people use evidence. It said to me, these people were talking to me about the social determinants of health, the underlying, the causes of ill health. We can, in health, we often worry about the risk factors, but actually it's the causes of the causes, the upstream determinants. And so I came up with the concept of livability because this is actually, these are the social determinants of health. People need to be able to live in communities that are safe and socially inclusive, cohesive and inclusive. Safe, people feel good. It's got to be environmentally sustainable. I think we're missing out here. If we're going to have a future, a good future, a sustainable future, that's got to be environmentally sustainable. There needs to be affordable housing, but there's no point providing affordable housing if it's not linked by public transport, walking and cycling infrastructure to everything that you need for daily living, to employment, education, public open space, really critically important, local shops and services. So this was our definition of livability, and as you've seen during COVID, what gets measured gets done. In public health, this is the way we work. We measure things and we monitor and we see what happens over time. So we took the view, well, we need to start measuring this concept of livability. We had our domains of livability, so let's start measuring it and seeing how we're performing as a city and then what we can do about it, feeding back the data to our policymaker and practitioner colleagues. And this was done in partnership. So we didn't just do this, looking at people and saying, you're getting this wrong. We did it in partnership with I had a Centre for Research Excellence, and so I had an advisory group, and we were doing it in partnership with them and also with the federal government, because some of our indicators now have been picked up by the federal government. And the question we were asking ourselves, what gets measured gets done, and are we creating livability for all? Who are the winners and who are the losers in our cities? So first of all, Melbourne's walkability. It's something that, we love Melbourne. We love what we have to offer. We talk about it as the most livable city or second most livable city in the world. But when we talk about walkability, this is just so people can walk to a local shop and service. We mapped this, and you can see that, in the inner city, which is nice and green, the middle level suburbs were doing pretty well. But out on the fringe, all people could do here, anything that's sort of from 5 to 1 or 1 to 5, very dark pink through to light pink, everyone, in fact, even 6, the very lowest of green, most people would drive in those areas. So we have designed a driving city, which I think in COVID has really been shown up our frailties, because it means that people don't have local shops and services. They have to drive and go into a big shopping centre. And I think it's really reinforced the importance of us delivering on what Melbourne's trying to do, the 20-minute neighbourhood. And actually, it's interesting because again, I say we're evidence-based. What we did was we looked at, what are the features in neighbourhoods that would encourage people to walk. So first of all, the average distance to an activity centre. Most people will only walk about 800 metres. In fact, that's what we've found to encourage walking. But you can see in Melbourne, to walk to an activity centre, the average distance that people have to travel is 1.2 3 kilometres. So you can see why people are not going to walk. It's worse in Perth, where I come from, but nevertheless, we're not doing well. For one of the most livable cities in the world, we actually have designed our city for driving, not for walking. The other thing is density, levels of density. We know from our research, actually that's not, the builds are not working. We know that if we're going to encourage walking, we need to get the densities right. And this is really important too from a green space area, to be able to have biodiversity. We need to get the densities right, but not take away all the greenery in our neighbourhood. But we need to get to about 25 to 30 dwellings per hectare. In Melbourne, we're building at about 12 to 14 dwellings per hectare, and that's not inconsistent with other cities. Sydney actually has the highest densities. I think they're about, from memory, about 16 or 17 dwellings per hectare. But Melbourne's only about 12 to 14. So again, evidence-based policy, haven't been doing things in an evidence-based way. We haven't had the evidence, but now we do. In terms of social infrastructure, how are we doing in terms of that? We see the same pattern. People in the inner city have access to all the sort of social infrastructure, health services, schools. If you live in the inner city, you're doing well, but if you're living out in the outer fringe, you might have none or 1 to 1.5 different types. We looked at 16 different types of social infrastructure. That's the numbers. And what we found was that in the pink areas, people don't have much access to services at all, but of course in the inner city you do. So the same sorts of principles apply. We're doing well in the inner city, but not so well in the outer suburban areas. Now, in terms of public transport, I know there's a lot of discussion about public transport at the moment. And what we've been arguing is that, if anyone can walk or cycle, we should be encouraging them to use public transport, to get off public transport and use an alternative. But when we look at the access to public transport, we see that in terms of we have a state policy that 95% of people should live within 400 metres of a public transport stop. And this is on here, we find that there's 14% of suburbs in Melbourne that actually achieve that sort of level of access, that they have a public transport stop within 400 metres. But then when we map, if there's a service every 30 minutes, so that creates another pattern. We see in the inner city, you see that there is a service every 30 minutes. We see that there's actually 36% of suburbs or 36% of people in Melbourne have that sort of level of access, that there is a public transport stop within 400 metres and that there's a service every 30 minutes. So you can see why we've created this driving city that, if there's only that sort of level of service, people are going to drive. We've also looked at whether people have the potential. Danielle was talking about the potential to get people onto bikes. What we found was that 28% of people in Melbourne live and work in the same area. But when we look at their use of active transport, it's very low. We find that in Melbourne, only 5% of people get to work using active forms of transportation. 16% use public transport, but only 5% use walking or cycling. And yet there's unmet demand there, or potential for an unmet demand, because 28% of people live and work in the same area, so they could potentially use an active mode. Now, I know public open space is probably of interest to you, and you have waterways where you have a lot of public open space. This is an incredibly important resource, both for health and well-being, but also for the biodiversity of the city and for heat island effects. So really critical infrastructure in our cities. When we look at Melbourne compared to other cities, what we see is that 82% of people in Melbourne live within 400 metres of a public open space. But when we add in what the size of that, so that might be good potentially as good from a biodiversity point of view, and also from a potentially good, depending on how it's designed, from a heat island effect if it's treed. But what happens when we look at the percentage of people who live within 400 metres of a public open space, that's more than 1.5 hectares, we find that only 49% of people have that sort of level of access. Now, we've seen during the COVID experience that public open space has become incredibly important and very much valued by the community. But we find that there's only 49% of people who have very close proximity to larger public open space, which is what's generally used for people to be physically active. And so the little pocket park, unless there's a network of them, is not so useful. Melbourne has a disproportionate number of very small parks, and that's quite different to Perth. Oh, I haven't got them, my bill didn't work. So in Perth, for example, over about 68% of people have access to a park within 400 metres that's over 1.5 hectares. So quite a different situation in Perth compared to Melbourne. And as a consequence of that, what we find in Perth is that people who live within close proximity to public open space are much more likely to be physically active, more so than in Melbourne, because Melbourne has a disproportionate number of pocket parks. Now, along the waterways, there's such a wonderful opportunity to create linear parks, to really open that up for the community. And I know that's something of great interest to the work that we've been doing on with Melbourne Water. I think there's an enormous amount of interest by the public. As COVID has shown up, they've really started to appreciate just how important local public open space is. So I hope that we can build on that to get the social licence for the future. People are very interested in housing stress, and of course we have an incredible number of people who are experiencing housing stress. This is the proportion of the population in the lowest socioeconomic area who are spending more than 40% or 30% of their income on housing, and we see that there has been an increase from this is census data from 2011 to 2016. About 39% of people are experiencing housing affordability stress. So this it'll be interesting to see what the implications are with COVID. There is discussion that house prices will fall. We won't have as much immigration. So this may change in the future, and that's up for discussion and interest. We have been looking at things like trying to pull all this together. You know, what are the implications of, you know, the totality of all these domains of livability? You know, the sorts of things that we've measured are transport, social infrastructure, employment, walkability, housing, public open space, air quality. And Carl Higgs, one of our colleagues at RMIT, has put this into an index to look at, well, you know, the alternative to the Economist Intelligence Use Index. We have our own index which we've mapped across the 21 cities in Australia, the largest cities in Australia, and pulled it together as an index. And what we did is it's all policy relevant. So we've tied it to policy. We've looked at you know, transport policy. In Melbourne, the policy is that people should live within 800 metres of a train stop, 600 metres of a tram stop, or 400 metres of a bus stop. So all of our indicators that we've developed have been all very policy relevant. So our measure of public transport is a policy relevant measure. And he's put it into an index. So this is what we call this the spaghetti diagram. All of our indicators are policy relevant. A number of things have gone in, and we've created an index. And what we find is that for each unit increase in livability, so this is real livability as opposed to Economist Intelligence Use in livability, walking, cycling and public transport use increases by 10 to 15%, and driving decreases by 12%. Now, a big part of that is because in more livable communities there are more destinations, and they are more compact, and there is slightly higher density, and that supports having more shops and services nearby, and it supports public transport as well. Cycling infrastructure is incredibly important to make it safe for cycling, but continuing to build low density, sprawling suburbs with just little cycle paths within the development is not going to achieve what we need. We need the cycle paths along the arterials going to all the shops and services, or all the activity centres, or the public transport stop nodes or train stations, and we also need to have the cycle paths are really important, and we also need to have more compact developments. So different types of urban design. We've talked in Melbourne about achieving the 20-minute neighbourhood. The 20-minute neighbourhood has never been more important than it is right now. Now, I keep on raising this issue about livability and sustainability, and one of the things is that we aren't building a sustainable city. We are a livable city, should be, as we've got in our definition, a sustainable city. This is work that was done by Peter Newton over at Swinburne University, and on the bottom axis here you've got the ecological footprint that we have for cities, and you can see along here, and on the vertical axis we have the Economist Intelligence and Livability Index for 2009. So nothing would have changed, but there's a couple of things that are interesting about this. So in terms of our ecological footprint, Melbourne, Perth, Sydney, Brisbane, we have a very high ecological footprint at 8, compared to Venice, who just won the who has beat us at the post last year and the year before on the Economist Intelligence Unit livability, but it has almost half our ecological footprint, probably because it's more compact, probably because it's got better public transport. And people say to me, oh, that's because it's a smaller city. But what about London and Manchester? Also comes out at just over 5. So it's not just about small populations. Amsterdam, and Paris, comes out here as well. So it's not just, it's actually about the way we've designed our cities. We need to be really thinking and getting behind delivering the 20-minute neighbourhood. And I'd be keen to hear from you about the role that water is going to play in that, and certainly and your waterways. So when we ask the question, healthy, livable Melbourne for all, how are we tracking? I think we have we've got a way to go. We're doing some things well. We're really moving on our policies now, but we still have a long way to go, as you can see. And we need to be thinking about this in terms of people. We're designing out this city for people, and we need to be doing that in a way that protects them and their futures. And we've seen during COVID just how important local community is. If you're interested in the lived experience of people who are living on the fringes of cities, I do encourage you to have a look at our documentary that we've done. This is Layla Farahani, who now works in local government, but we did a documentary about the lived experience of living on the urban fringe. It's called Living Livable, and if you just Google that at RMIT, you can find it. It's very interesting. There's a short version, a couple of minute version, which you can have a look at, but it does tell us that we have got some issues in the way we're doing. People go onto the fringe and live in the fringe with high aspirations, but they spend a lot of time in their cars, which is bad for the environment and bad for their health and well-being, and they live there for a long time with little amenity. So it's problematic. I guess the other thing is the planet. This is not a dress rehearsal. We've got a responsibility. On our watch, we are building cities which are not sustainable. It's really alarming to me. I was so distressed, I'm sure you were too, when we saw these flying foxes perish in the Queensland heat wave in 2019. I was so horrified to see this, and yet we had the summer that we did last summer. I think acting on and doing what we can to reduce emissions is really critical. And as I mentioned before, for me as an older adult, facing young people who ask me, what are you doing about this? There's a big responsibility for all of us to be thinking about these issues. It ties nicely to the Sustainable Development Goal. What's our purpose? The UN Sustainable Development Goals brings together 17 goals and targets to be able to create a more sustainable future, which brings in climate change, sustainable cities, biodiversity, water. So there's a really great opportunity for us to help to contribute in Australia to achieving the Sustainable Development Goals. If people aren't interested in those things, it's good for business anyway. What we find is, walkable communities are good for business. This is work that's been done by Victoria Walks. Street improvements can boost retail up to 40%, rents by 20%. There's work coming out now showing that walkable communities do command higher prices over time. So I think there's a great opportunity for reduced social costs and more private profit by building better communities, safer communities, COVID-friendly cities, and more sustainable communities. And when I talk about what we need, I talk about that we need delightful, livable density. I'm not talking about high-rise, not what I call down here in the left-hand corner, dreadful density, horrible density that's really doesn't serve anyone, and it has shown up to how vulnerable we are building high-rise density, which with small apartments has really shown its full problems and the vulnerability of our cities in the COVID situation. But the medium to low to medium density is really so critically important, and it could help to create more vibrant communities. It's not just about density though, because and I think that's what the delightful livable part is that when we have density, we also need to have destinations and diversity. And I know in the current circumstance, what we're finding is that it's really putting a lot of pressure on those local destinations. And I guess the question is going to be, post-COVID, how do these main streets recover? That is something that is going to need to be thought about. But there's discussion about the way we need to think about main streets and small shopping centres in terms of how do we curate those, and in terms of governance in the future. Something may need to be different in the way we're curating these really important community assets into the future. One critical thing is we need to be building our communities and our suburbs and our villages with densities or distances that support sustainable development. I mentioned that we're building our shopping centres, our activity centres, 1.5 kilometres from, or 1.4 kilometres from people's homes. This is not really a walkable distance. It is a cyclable distance, it's true, but we need to be able to get the densities up to be able to build a city of villages. And that's really what in Melbourne we've got now, the 20-minute neighbourhood concept. So important to get the densities up a little bit higher to create more vibrancy and local shops and services nearby. I think from a COVID point of view, that's really important, but also from a sustainability point of view. And we need to have design of green space that honours biodiversity, protects biodiversity, and reduces the green heat island effects. And this is the combination of green infrastructure that's required. It's the waterways and how we manage those, which is in your area. It's the protection of established growth, and it's the introduction of new growth. But it's also about the size of the blocks that we use and to protect, to ensure that in established areas and in new areas we still have green open space and greenery in our homes. One of the big problems that we're seeing now with density in the middle level suburbs is that people are knocking down homes and putting in denser development, which on one hand is good, but it's actually taking away tree canopy. So that's incredibly destructive and important, that we need to ensure that we don't take away our greenery in these neighbourhoods. Now, one of the things that we've recommended from doing this work is that we really need to be using evidence. And I think one of the things we've shown during this pandemic is just in the way that public health people use evidence to drive interventions. It's been an interesting thing for me because I've been working in this field now for 20 years, and it's taken a long time for health to get on to reconnecting health with planning. They are getting into it now, but that's because we have an incredible evidence base to which will allow the health sector to take this seriously. And that's what it's required, and that's what we're seeing during COVID. You can see everything is evidence-based, but we need to, now that we've got this evidence, be creating evidence-informed policies. We need to have more ambition in the way we're building our cities. We need short, medium, long-term targets. It's one of the things, the problem with targets is people try to avoid them in order to not be criticised that they haven't achieved it. In our report where we wrote on healthy livable cities, I tried to avoid us being critical, but saying be ambitious, have ambitious targets, but have short-term, medium and long-term targets, but don't move away from ambition in our policies. We really need to be using policy as a way of driving outcomes. We need, I think, spatial indicators. Spatial indicators have been great for us, be able to really illustrate what's going on. It's great for evaluating how well policy is being implemented, because we're able to show spatial inequalities. And the more we do this, the more shocking it is that we are achieving the cities that we are, and the people who are really the losers in our cities, who are, there's winners and losers in a city in terms of infrastructure. A lot of the losers are people who are living, who have built with great aspiration their homes on the fringe, but they're not getting the services that they need. They're not getting and because of the densities being so low, they may never get those sorts of amenities. So I think we need to be able to use the spatial indicators have been particularly good to see where is policy being implemented. You can do it in your own areas as well. I think it's really a great asset that we have access to now. Really, big data is really changing things in the way we do things in our city planning. And we also need, I think, metropolitan governance. We really need to be thinking about the city as a whole, a system. And clearly water and the role that you play is really critical to this, but it's a system. We need a systems approach, and we need to have integration. I often hear some of the challenges that developers deal with in terms of all the different sorts of rules from the different utilities in different areas, the different local government areas, the state government. We need to have metropolitan governance to be able to achieve the cities that we need to ensure that we do end up with the cities that we both deserve and need for a more sustainable future, a more resilient cities, which I think really COVID has shown us up to show how important that really is. If you're interested in this work, we have a report that's available on the web, and we will also have scorecards. We have scorecards now for 21 cities in the federal government's national performance framework. I can't remember, I think there's 3 or 4 in Melbourne, but they are available. We have, if you're interested in the metrics that we've come up with, we've had a big program of research where we've looked at the metrics. What is it going to take to create a more livable city? And the metrics we've published over it's been almost a decade of research on our urban livability checklist. And we've also now got the Australian Urban Observatory, where you can go in and access this data for free. You can have a look at local government data. For a small subscription, people can have a look at sub-LGA. So these data are available. We think this is a fantastic asset. We wanted to get the data off our computers out so that people can use it and to create better cities. The subscription model is important for us because we want to replicate this over time. The whole idea of this is to benchmark and monitor to see how can we change our cities to create a better future. Now, I like to leave people with a thought. This is not a dress rehearsal. This is really, to me, important. I know COVID is important. I know that there's going to be pressures on you to go back to core business, but I can encourage you to really think about your assets, the things that you're doing, because they are going to be really important. We need to get behind you to ensure that those assets are used for community good, to encourage for greenways to be used for heat island, biodiversity, recreation, as well as the important role you play in delivering water. And I like to bring all of this in to say, well, why should we do this? Because it's not really about us, it's really about our future generations. This is my little niece, Viola. She was asked to go to school dressed up as her superhero, and she went dressed up as her big brother. That was her superhero because she admires him so much. Really, it's for kids like this that we're doing the work that we're doing. When we ask to account to ourselves, what are we doing to create a healthy, more sustainable future? I have Viola in mind because the work that I'm promoting is actually going to create, hopefully, a healthier future, a more sustainable future for her and her young generations that follow her. So I leave that thought with you. It's important responsibility that we all have, I think. So thank you.
Thanks, Billie. You've actually finished up earlier than we timed, so we've got some more time for discussion, and some questions have actually come through the chat. And for participants, please keep firing in some of those questions. Nick wants to know, Billie, he mentions in some respects the principles for livable, sustainable cities have been known for some time and reflected in previous urban planning efforts. So what do you see as the root cause or impediment to change that's the problem we really need to be tackling together?
I think, well, we sort of talk about it. People sort of talk about livability, but they're not measuring it. And I think what gets measured does get done. I think we need to be really clear about measuring things to show, so it's not just rhetoric. And to me, what's happened is that we don't have evidence-informed planning. So in the past, if you look at the densities across our cities, I keep on going on about density, and it's not just density, because what density is important for is it determines amenity. But we've still been planning until now, until the recent Plan Melbourne, our policy has been to build at 15 dwellings per hectare, net density, not even gross density. And that is a real problem, because it means that there are just not enough people to create the cities that we need. And we've done policy analysis across the country. Perth has a density target now of 26 dwellings per hectare. Melbourne, in Plan Melbourne, went to 20 houses per hectare. It hasn't been delivered yet. The new the livable neighbourhood guidelines are using some of our evidence. They're putting 25 dwellings per hectare. That's what I mean. We want something, but we haven't had the evidence to inform how to go about it and what will the implications be. So I think partly it's been, hoping that would create livable cities by saying it without having evidence to inform it. And I think that's really one other thing. And I think the other thing is, what's the word? A sort of reluctance. The business as usual is easier for people to do. Now, what we've seen now, for those of you who are from Melbourne, you'll see that on the fringe, we've got more compact development, smaller lots, but still the same size houses. We have the largest houses in the world, apparently, when they've done figures on the size of our houses. But all the roofs just touch together. So we're not producing a good outcome. We're actually producing quite a disastrous outcome from heat-on effect by diversity. So, I don't know, we've been a little complacent, I think, in terms of our the way we've gone about it. We've gone for a business as usual and just sort of without really trying to mandate the things that we really mandate or set in place and really encourage innovation, because there are a lot of developers who do want to do things differently. And I think we can produce a better product if we put in place the frameworks that can deliver this. So partly it's policy, partly it's encouraging innovation, and partly it's monitoring and seeing what happens over time. Because I think monitoring over time, setting up ourselves to monitor our implementation is really critical.
Faria mentions that Singapore seems to be mastering the multiple use of their areas. For example, a green environmental corridor is also a key cycling route at a tourism-worthy standard. Walking, hiking areas, lungs for the city. Can we be doing better in this regard in Victoria?
Yeah, I think most definitely. Well, as I said, what we have is a lot of small parks in Australia. We've got fantastic waterways, and we've talked about this in Melbourne Water. We've got fantastic waterways. There's so much potential to create these networks. And I think the other thing is, the potential to create networks that combine cycling infrastructure, but do it in a way. What we've seen with COVID is some of the problems with our shared paths. People have really struggled on shared paths because, the conflict between pedestrians and cyclists that cycle quite fast. So I think there is a great opportunity there. I think, and it's going to become more and more important as our climate changes, as the heat goes up. It's never been more important than to ensure that we have a greener city.
Yes. David mentions the phenomenon, it seems, of the movement of people to the regions, and he's wondering if the livability issue that you've talked about for Melbourne will increase this movement of people. Now working from anywhere seems to be the new normal. What's your thoughts?
Oh, I'm so excited about that. I mean, I think this is the new normal. I think the opportunities here are really great. I think what we've found is that if you look at our livability reports for all the 21 cities, what you see is that there's a lot of regional cities, the larger regional cities, that have a lot of amenity that, and they've certainly got good bones. They've got like the walkable communities. One of the things I worry about is that some of the mistakes that we make on our outer suburban areas here, the suburban sprawl, is being replicated in these regional cities, which is such a shame. Why do we do that? It's really replicating a problem that means that everyone has to drive everywhere. But they have great bones. The networks in the older part of the city, there's so much great urban design out there. What some of them lack is some of the amenities. They lacked employment, and now, of course, there's this potential for knowledge-based workers at least to work from home, if not every day, many days, that should make it much more viable for people to live in the regions. And it's interesting, actually, this is not so much relevant to maybe your members, but we looked at child development in another study that we looked at child development, and what we found was that children who what we were interested in is children who were living in a lower income area but were doing well in terms of child development. It was based on the National Census of Children. And what we found was that a lot of those places were regional cities. And I don't know if you've ever lived in a regional city. I lived in Albany. I was the foundation director of UWA set up a campus down in Albany on the south coast of Western Australia. So a small town, a city of 30,000. And it's just such a different environment for families there, because you spend a lot of time with your kids, and the community's small, and so there's it takes a village to raise a child. You really get that experience when you live in a regional city. And I do wonder what part of the reason why those children, they may not have as much money, the communities may not have as much money, but they certainly have a lot more community. And I think the potential for regional communities is really great, and I'm hoping that what we see out of COVID is a serious look. I mean, Australia is quite unusual in terms of our regional, the way that we haven't got what we have is a lot of people live in our cities, our major cities, rather than our regional cities. And so I guess to support that, we need better public transport, better rail to support people living in regional cities, a network of rail that connect people into the city. And there's discussions about high-speed rail. I think these are all very exciting opportunities, but obviously digital infrastructure is really critical. To allow people to live and work from home, we need to really be ensuring that we've got the digital infrastructure that will support that, and good schools. I mean, that's the other thing, is that people often come to cities because they're looking for their children to come to better schools. So really supporting schools in regional cities seems to be really important.
Mm. And you mentioned some of the analysis with your research around some of the regional cities. I believe you've got data beyond Melbourne, haven't you, for Victorian towns?
Yes. Yeah, so we have Bendigo, Ballarat. So we have 21 cities in the National Performance Framework. So all the cities that have been put into the National Performance Framework, might have Shepparton as well. So all the largest cities in that are in Australia are included in our Australian Urban Observatory. So yeah, it's quite comprehensive, and I think that what that allows us to do then is to look at where there could be investments in infrastructure to support those regional cities, particularly if more people are able to work from home. And I think it's a great opportunity.
Yes, well, one of our members attached to one of those towns has asked, could they get the links to those reports, or where could they find them?
Yeah, I can do that right as we're talking. I can just link those into the chat if you like.
That'd be wonderful.
I'll do that. I've got it opened up here as well. Here's the observatory. So I'll just put it into the chat.
Thank you.
And also the National Livability Report. I'll just find that.
Terrific. Thanks.
You love the new technology where you can it's all there.
Yeah, absolutely. There's a few more questions, Billie.
Yeah, I'm still here. I'm just looking up the...
Yes, I know. don't want you to do too much multitasking.
I can manage that. You're right.
Yara's made a comment about water and sewer services funded on a strict cost recovery basis based on customer regulator approval. He's wondering what quantitative metrics could we incorporate into such benefit cost analyses that could capture the livability benefits.
I think that's a really, really very important question, like the co-benefits of the work that you do, and creating the argument that, you know, investment in these things, the work that you do and the investments is worth it because of the co-benefits to health and well-being, biodiversity, potentially transportation, because if, you know, you've got waterways and you can put cycle paths along there. I think there's a great opportunity for your sector to be funding that economic analysis that looks at the co-benefits for investment, you know, you doing this, so it's not just about minimizing your prices to not invest in these areas, but seeing, you know, if you didn't, you know, what would be the cost if you're not doing it? You know, I think that's a really important question. We often focus on the cost of doing things. What's the cost? Because it would just be in other areas. It would be just, you know, the costs come to another sector. And I think with livability, my argument has been that livability should be a concept that's held by the Premier, the Prime Minister, the Mayor, and it should be asking all of its departments and sectors to contribute to that. So rather than just focusing on, you know, one department trying to save money, which has a cost in another department, then we should be thinking that there are co-benefits from this and everyone should be contributing to this, and that if you don't spend your money in that and you just bring your prices down, that might impact on, you know, the health and well-being, which ends up in the health system. Health budget is really huge. Like chronic disease budget, there was some work that was done in South Australia, and it showed that over time, the health budget, if they didn't do something about chronic disease, which is actually everyone's problem because the health sector cannot fix this by itself, the health budget would overtake the state budget. So, like, these are huge budgets that really need all the sectors to contribute. The UN did a report in 2011 talking about this. It was a high-level meeting on the prevention and control of communicable diseases, and it made the point, I can also give you a link to that every sector needs to be involved in this, because the health sector can simply patch people up when people are ill. They can encourage people, and we're just seeing that now with COVID. The health department implores people, tells them, don't do this, don't do this, do the other, you know, what to do. They fix people up when they're sick, but they can't change the system that creates the conditions for good or bad health. That's all the other sectors outside of health, and that's why you are so important. You are health organisations. You contribute to health in a big way, as do many other sectors, and I think that's something that could be picked up in, you know, an economic study. And I think the time is right for it, because we now have much more evidence around this about the benefits, and we need to be looking at the co-benefits, and also in terms of biodiversity and that sort of thing. I mean, I think, you know, obviously you have, you know, a lot of assets that are really contribute in a big way to society that just needs to be acknowledged.
Now, I know Rob Adams spoke some time ago about the model of Barcelona and tried to introduce that concept, which I know has tipped into the 15-minute neighbourhood idea, and etc. Nigel asks the question, though, are there some really good examples of high density communities that we could look at?
Well, I guess they're coming on board. I think in the Australian context, they're coming on board. And it's not high density. I should just emphasise that when we're talking 25 dwellings per hectare, it's not high density. It's very low density by international standards. It's just a little bit more intense than we are now. And it doesn't mean that you have to have, you know, lots of high rise. It's not high rise. High rise is important in areas where it's appropriate. But high-rise is not what I'm talking about when I talk about delightful livable density. It's enough density to get to make it viable to have shops and services nearby, and that's not very high. I mean, I guess the traditional suburbs in Melbourne, you know, the inner south, it's a really Fitzroy, for example. I live in Fitzroy. It's got that's the sort of level of density we're talking about. So you might have an apartment block, but you also have single residential homes, and they're of different sizes. And it's actually the diversity. That's why we talk about the diversity is so important. It's not everyone just living in an apartment. I mean, there's cities across the globe which are, Copenhagen, for example, or that work well. But it's really like if you think about just in our own patch, the fabric of the inner city, which has this mix of land use mixes, a mix of density. That's really what we're talking about. And it's also really important about thinking about the way we design our roads, putting in these great big huge roads that just have lots of people and redistributing employment across the city. That's really important as well. And I think that's been shown up is that it's going to be interesting what the future of work is after COVID, because I think what it's shown is that we can work from home, and you can imagine what would happen to the city if 2 or 3 days a week we had people working from home more. That would make a huge difference. It's shown up the vulnerabilities of our high rise and about poorly designed high rise. We need to be thinking about how we build a higher density housing to accommodate a circumstance like this. So some people have really suffered, and we also need to be thinking about, I think, the street networks and how they're designed, because what we've shown is that people need more space.
And this excellent work that's going on, is that having some influence on structure planning, Kate asks? So what impact is the RMIT research having potentially on planning? And I know a number of our members are curious about that because planning can often be a big challenge for us. So very interested in influencing that.
I'm very excited. I mean, I'm now going to brag for a minute. We design our research to have impact. We work closely, whenever we set up a new project, we involve policymakers in our work and practitioners in our work, because otherwise it's really a big commitment we have at RMIT is to create value for others and to have research that has impact. I've done this for a long time because mainly I was late to do my PhD, and I finished later, and so I wasn't going to just sit around and just do something that wasn't going to have an impact. So we've been designing our work. So we've had a lot of work. We worked with the West Australian government. We evaluated the livable neighbourhood guidelines. They loved what we did in terms of showing them what part of their policies were working and not working. It was, working with researchers is like watching grass grow, we're very boring because we take time. But what's happened over time is that the momentum has really picked up. And we, for example, the 20-minute neighbourhood, just some concrete examples, the 20-minute neighbourhood includes our targets for density, and includes our targets for the size, the 800-metre target. We've got the federal government in its national performance framework for cities has picked up some of our indicators, which are health promoting, our walkability index, our social infrastructure, our public open space, and our access to public transport indicator have all gone into the national performance framework. Local governments using it to set up the framework, and actually that's a big thrill, because what we have set our observatory up to do is to provide indicators that local government can use to benchmark and monitor over time, so they can go right down sub-LGA and see where in the community they need to intervene, and then they can benchmark and monitor over time. So the reason why we're charging a subscription is that we want this to be a tool that we can repeat over time, so so people can use it. So I feel like it's been designed, it's not by mistake. I mentioned that initially it was my work with the health department when I first came to Melbourne in 2011. We have designed everything to be policy relevant. So we review policy, we create the indicators that really feed back how well we're doing in terms of our policy delivery. And it's not to have a go. I mean, we're really careful in the way we frame everything. It's really trying to make a difference, provide evidence that will make a difference. And I'm really pleased that I feel like, people do respect our work and people are using it, which is, makes my heart sing. I know it sounds dorky, but it does make my heart sing that people actually do use it, because it's been designed for that purpose.
Right. Final question from me, Billie, is you mentioned that we are health organisations. I love that idea. And our members encapsulate all of Victoria, and I'm very interested in your thoughts perhaps a few things that you think as water corporations, not just for Melbourne, but for urban centres across Victoria, that we could do to actually practically contribute further to the concept of livability and making Victoria more livable?
Well, I mean, water and sanitation is basic public health. This is where it all started. Public health, making cities safer, and you can see, the effect on disease when Melbourne first introduced water and sanitation. It had a huge impact on the health and well-being of the community. So it's really basic public health. It's been great to see you working on the, analysing sewage to see. I suppose that's probably water's not yours, but sanitation system, to be able to actually see where COVID is. But I think the biggest thing that you have are assets. So you have your, you have assets that you've got that could be used to create a more livable city. And I think the fundamental is water. If we don't have water, we are sunk. So clearly it's critical. But I think where you've got assets, where you've got green space, making that available for people to use, seeing how you could use creatively, make that available to increase the livability of our cities seems to be incredibly important. And then, the potential for where you do have assets, depending on the design of it, combining it with other activities. So part of it's recreation, part of it's biodiversity, part of it could be active transport, depending on the shape of it. So I think seeing yourselves as part of that ecosystem is so incredibly important, because it's the contributions that each of the sectors play to creating a livable city that will actually help us deliver that. But I do think there's a great opportunity for you to really look at the co-benefits of what your contribution, that to me, like the economic work that would show what the potential is, and just how much you do contribute, would really be a very useful piece of work that you could consider as a sector.
And we actually are doing some of that right now, so that's
I'll be very excited to see that too.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Billie. It's been a pleasure to have you. I know people can't applaud, but I'm sure there is an applause out there for you.
I'll do that. Applaud myself. Thanks, everyone. Enjoy your sessions today, and it's been a pleasure to talk to you. So, thank you.
Thanks, Billie. So we're going to take a break and come back at 11:25, and that will be a set time, a strict time, in which we head into our second set for the day. See you then. Welcome back, everyone. It's fantastic to be here on such a lovely day, and to have so many of you in the room joining us from many parts of Victoria. We're now heading into the second set. We've heard about macro trends and livability this morning, and there is an underlying theme connecting these in the next presentation, and it's about resilience. Dr. Andre Taylor is joining us now to share his insights on building resilient leadership and teams. Andre is a leadership development specialist, water practitioner and sustainability practitioner. Andre's professional purpose is to work with enthusiastic leaders to drive positive change and make the world a better place, whilst demonstrating values of integrity, enabling others, sustainability and continuous learning. Andre has worked in the water sector for most of his 30-year career. He did his PhD research on leadership in the water sector. In fact, we were colleagues at Monash. And having known Andre for many years, I've recognised him also as a leader in the water sector, doing much to nurture the industry's capacity for the ever-changing future. So welcome, Andre.
Thank you, Peter. I hope you can hear me okay. Great. The technology's solved. Thank you for that kind introduction. And good morning, everyone. I'm really honoured to be able to speak with you today about this topic. How can we build resilience in ourselves as leaders, but also in the people that we influence, our direct reports, our mentees, our teams, and our organisations. And I hope that you've been enjoying the conference. I'm coming to this topic from the perspective of a leadership coach. I primarily work with people on a one-to-one basis, emerging and more senior leaders. So that's the perspective that I'm going to be adopting today when I tackle this topic. I thought I should start with defining what resilience is. So I put a slide of some bamboo on this presentation. It's not something I normally do. It's an introduced species and not highly regarded in Australia. But in China, in ancient Chinese literature, the bamboo is a plant that's highly regarded. It's seen as a symbol of the harmony that exists between people and the natural environment. It's a very useful plant. And when you think about a bamboo forest like this one, storms come with strong winds, snow, hail, and they're able to withstand those winds. They don't snap under the pressure of the snow or the winds. They accumulate the water from those storm events and the nutrients, and they not only bounce back, but they grow as a result. And for me, that's the key here around leadership. Resilience as a self-leadership capacity. It's not just about bouncing back from periods of hardship, although it is. It's also about growing back stronger, using that experience to grow. So that's how I perceive resilience in the context of a self-leadership skill or capacity. I thought I'd just do a quick temperature check of the group to get you to do something as well. Fee, if you're running the technology, would we be able to get the first poll question running? And the first poll question invites you to give us some feedback about to what extent is building personal resilience currently a significant issue for you as a leader, people in your organisation and or your mentees? How significant is this issue at the moment? So can you give me some feedback on that? All right, I can see the results coming back in. So it looks like a pretty significant issue. We might just remember that I understand we've got an executive audience today, and I would argue, feel free to disagree, that executives are a pretty resilient bunch generally. You can't survive in those sort of roles without high levels of resilience. So it might be worth just reflecting that if you're finding 2020 challenging, chances are other people in your organisations are finding it even more challenging on average. All right, let's go to the second poll question, Fee. To what extent does your organisation currently have an effective capacity building program to help people assess and strengthen their resilience? Maybe that's a program as part of a bigger leadership development program, perhaps, or it might be a once-off training initiative. But what have you got in place in your organisations? If you can put some feedback in there. Okay, so it looks like most people have got either don't know about it. Oh no, it's about even. Don't know, we've got something, I'm not sure if it's effective, and we've got something in place. So when I look at that data, I'm saying, okay, there's room for improvement there if we conclude that building resilience is an important capacity building initiative that we need to do. So thank you. Let's go to the third poll in our temperature check, and that is, to what extent would you like to have a comprehensive set of tools or strategies for building resilience that you can use yourself as an executive leader, but you can also help others to use, your direct reports, your mentees, the teams that you lead? Okay, so that you're pretty keen to get a good toolkit there. One of the points I wanted to raise, and I might as well raise it here, is I think it's important to develop a broad set of tools for building resilience, because the tools that might work for you may not work for your mentee, for example, or a direct report, or the tools that are working for you right now might not work as effectively in another context. So I think it is important to build a broad range of tips and tools and strategies that you can use yourself and help others to use. So thank you for participating. It's also nice to know that there's someone on the other side of this computer that's listening in. I'll keep going. So what I thought I'd do today is to share with you briefly 7 principles about building resilience. These are kind of key concepts that I think it's important to just lock in. It helps with our mindset. And then move on to 3 practical strategies that you can apply both as part of self-leadership, but also to enable others. I've resisted the temptation to overload this presentation with lots, so I'm only going to focus on 3, and I've chosen 3 that you may not know about or you haven't thought much about, rather than the obvious strategies. And I don't want to just dismiss the obvious strategies, and by obvious strategies I mean things like taking short breaks when you can. I know that's hard in Victoria at the moment. I'm based in New South Wales. Separating work from home, again, difficult at the moment. Staying connected to friends and family, looking after your physical health, getting enough sleep. I think these obvious strategies will be well known to this group. And just because I'm not focusing on them today doesn't mean they're not important. They definitely are. But I want to expand beyond that set of strategies to go into hopefully some new territory. And lastly, I'm going to share with you some resources. These are my 3 favourite resources that I'm using pretty frequently at the moment around building resilience as a leadership capacity that I'd like to share with you. And one of them is also a case study that might be useful to you from the United States that looks at how to set up a program it's actually an energy utility, but it would apply in a water utility as well, about how you might design, evaluate and deliver a comprehensive program to build resilience in your organisation. So that's where we're heading. So let's get started with the principles. I'll move over these fairly briefly. The first one is to see resilience as something that can be consciously developed. It's like a muscle. It's like confidence. Sure, some people are more resilient than others. Some people are more confident than others, but we can build resilience if we choose to do so and we've got the right strategies in place. So we need a growth mindset rather than a fixed mindset for this topic. Second principle is that the concepts that we're talking about today apply not only at the self level, and I spend most of my time there as a leadership coach working with individuals who recognise this as a capacity building need, but it also applies as teams. We need to build resilience in teams. For example, a team might be working on a very complex challenge, a wicked problem over many years. They have setbacks, it's hard to see progress, and it's very easy to get distracted and do other things or lose momentum or burn out or just leave. So those teams need resilience just as individual leaders need resilience, and it's the same for an organisation. An organisation is effectively one big team or group of teams. So the principles and the strategies I'm going to share with you today can be applied at different levels, and as an executive leader I think you will have the capacity to work in all 3 of those spaces, probably more than I would as a leadership coach. The next principle I wanted to raise, and Peter mentioned it briefly in his introduction, I think you've done some work on those macro trends or mega trends already in this conference, but when I read and have discussions with colleagues about these mega trends, I quickly come to the conclusion that in the 21st century as knowledge workers, we're going to need more and more resilience. So just think of some of those mega trends about globalization, climate change, casualization of the workforce, greater levels of debt, disruptive industries, artificial intelligence and robotics, the blurred line between work and home, you name it. All of those trends to me send a very clear signal that we're going to need more resilience as individual knowledge workers and leaders. We're going to need more resilience in our organizations as well. So for me, that means we need to invest both individually, but also in our teams and organizations. The 4th principle is that hardship is the crucible for leadership development growth, including the capacity of resilience. So I'm sure you've experienced this as well, given this is an executive audience. But if you think back to times when you've grown the most as a leader, I'm sure you're thinking about times when you were stretched, you were in the deep end, you were struggling at times, you discovered abilities that you didn't know you had, and your comfort zone expanded. And while we might not appreciate 2020 for a whole range of reasons, I'm sure we will look back after this pandemic and we'll say, you know what, 2020 was a particularly testing year, but it's helped me to grow in a number of areas, and it's made me stronger as a result. So it might be worth thinking back to some of the times when you've grown as a leader. I can go way back to when I was at school. I was fortunate to go to a school in Tasmania that had a very strong outdoor education program. Sadly, a lot of these programs have died off in schools because they're risky from a legal perspective. It's a real shame, but I was outside my comfort zone constantly at that school, on the mountains, mountain climbing, rock climbing, whitewater canoeing, expanding my comfort zone. And that was my first experience about building resilience and confidence that I could endure difficult times. And that spilled over to my career, and I can think of other times as well. So those sort of experiences need to be reframed. And as leaders, we can help people to do that. You know, it's called sense making, where we reframe challenges and hardships, maybe for our team, as a growth opportunity to make us stronger and more effective in the future. The fifth principle I wanted to share with you is recognizing the difference between pressure and stress. This is an important mindset issue, and I'll come back to this later in the presentation. Do you recognize this fellow? I'm guessing most people are based in Victoria in this conference, and as Victorians, you might recognise this Test cricketer, Keith Miller, arguably Australia's most decorated all-rounder in Test cricket, and he had the nickname Nugget, and he was seen as the golden boy of Australian cricket after the Second World War. And he played cricket with a huge smile and a free spirit and a great sense of humour. And he was very charismatic, very, very popular cricketer. Before my time, I didn't see him play. But when he was asked, how is it that he doesn't seem to feel any of the pressure that surrounds him as a Test cricketer, and if I'm sure most people have been to the MCG. I did a tour there with my family a year ago, and when we got to the edge of the MCG, I can only imagine the pressure you'd be under as an opening batsman walking out on a Boxing Day Test to that arena. I would be feeling the pressure. It would be creating stress if I was that cricketer. But for Keith Miller, no stress. He was relaxed. He was laughing, had a wonderful time, and very high-performing cricketer. And he was asked, how is this the case that he didn't allow the pressure of Test match cricket to generate stress? And he said that he was a fighter pilot in the Second World War. He flew missions over Germany, Central Europe, and he was in dogfights with German Messerschmitts. And after that experience, he reframed the hardship and the pressure of Test match cricket to be just a game. He's not going to allow any of that pressure to generate stress after that experience. So again, mindset is critical here, recognizing that sure, we have the capacity to be surrounded by lots of pressures, but we can choose how much of it we allow to become stress. The two are different. The sixth and penultimate principle I wanted to share relates to this concept of rumination, and this is a key one. So if we look at people whose resilience is fading, is being chipped away, they're stressed, rumination is often a key component to that. Ruminating is when you relive a past experience and attach a negative emotion to it. So imagine you've got some 360-degree feedback. I'm sure you get that from time to time. You've got some harsh criticism in your feedback. Your rumination would be if you're just reliving that feedback, you're agonizing over it, you're kind of cringing, you're waking up in the middle of the night, you're thinking about it, and you're not letting it go, you're not turning it into a positive action plan. And as you're ruminating, you're generating anxiety, and it's chipping away at your resilience and confidence. And a lot of people that I work with, particularly emerging leaders, the team leader level leaders, are ruminators, and it generates stress, anxiety, lack of confidence, and also damages their resilience. So we've got to get on top of that quickly. The key is learning to reflect properly. I'm going to come back to that when we look at some strategies. The last principle I wanted to share with you, and I think I've touched on it already when we did that poll, is that developing leaders need to have an experimental mindset. There's an academic and practitioner in Europe called Professor Herminia Ibarra. You might have read some of her papers on authentic leadership. I have a lot of time for her work, and she talks about this mindset of playful experimentation as a leader, trying new things, experimenting, not getting too upset when they don't work, but constantly growing, getting outside your comfort zone, trying new leadership styles so that you can be authentic in a range of styles. And it's the same as resilience. We need to broaden our toolkit, our options, experiment with them, reflect what's working, what's not, try something new, and constantly grow our range of tools that we have, and hopefully I'll help that process today. So experiment. All right, so there's 7 principles that I think are worth kind of tucking away. It'll help with our mindset. Let's now shift to looking at some strategies that we can apply. The first strategy is to be very clear about your true north, your purpose as a leader, and your core values. Now, as executive leaders, you would have spent time on this for sure, and probably numerous times. So, what is your purpose as an individual leader? What are your core values? But I think what a lot of leaders don't do is they don't go back and revisit that purpose and values from time to time, because it does evolve, it does shift, and it needs to be done fairly frequently. And it also needs to be done as a team. A team should have a purpose and values, and an organisation should have a purpose and values. Again, it needs to be revisited. Now, why is this relevant to resilience? Because if we're clear on our true north, our purpose and our values, and we're doing work that's aligned with that purpose, then we're more likely to be intrinsically motivated to plough on, to endure through difficult periods and just keep at it. Yeah. So if I'm leading a team through a very difficult period, for example, I want to make sure we're all clear on our purpose, our values of our team. I want to make sure that everyone is doing work that's aligned with that purpose, and they see it as being rewarding, and the vision is pulling them, and it's worth keeping on going and putting time and energy and effort and blood, sweat and tears into the team's work, because it's worth it. The purpose, the true north, the mission, whatever you want to call it, is worth it. So taking time to revisit that is important. If you haven't done that recently, a good way of doing that is to have a look at this TED Talk by Adam Lipczek. We won't play the video now, but in the handout I've put a hyperlink to the TED Talk, and he asks leaders just to answer a set of, I think it's 5 questions. And if you answer those questions, you can quickly roll that into a purpose statement. It's a nice little exercise. So the first question is, what's your name? Pretty easy one. Then what do you love doing? Who do you do it for? What need do those people need from you, or want or need? And lastly, what change results from you helping those people with that need? And if you work through those questions, and then you can roll that into a purpose statement, maybe throw in your values as well. So it's a nice little exercise. I'd encourage you to do it if you haven't revisited your purpose and values. And of course, think about whether you're doing work that's aligned with your purpose as well. That's critical. The second strategy I wanted to share with you relates to mindset. So we choose our mindset, and it's fundamental. In leadership development, this is so important. In a large leadership program, for example, many of you would know that I work as one of my hats with the International Water Centre. We run a big 9-month leadership program every year. We've been doing it for 10 years. And at the first intensive, the first day, morning tea, I can get a sense for the mindset of the people in the room, and I can pick which people are really going to thrive right after, morning tea. So the mindset is fundamental. As a leadership development specialist, I'd like to think it's the quality of the program design and the coaching that makes a big difference. That matters, but the mindset is fundamental, plus other concepts like developmental readiness. So for resilience, as well as other aspects of self-leadership, I think we need to cultivate a mindset that is a growth mindset, not a fixed mindset. For example, reframing setbacks and hardships as learning opportunities, showing up, doing our best, focusing on the process, but letting go of the outcomes, and that can be difficult. Expressing gratitude, I'll come back to that in a moment. That's a good concept for resilience. Aiming to be at our best so we can help others, so not sacrificing our own health and our own well-being to help others, but looking after ourselves first, making sure we're at our very best so we've got the capacity to help others. And lastly, getting comfortable being uncomfortable. As a leader that wants to grow, I want to stretch my comfort zone. If I'm feeling a little outside my comfort zone, like I am right now, because this is technology I haven't used before, that's good, because I'm in a space where I'm learning and I'm building confidence and resilience. So that's where I need to be if I want to grow as a leader or as a practitioner. So who chooses the mindset? That's us. But we can also help people that we work with to choose a mindset that enables them to grow and be more resilient. Now, the third strategy I wanted to share with you is a bit sneaky. It's got 4 parts or 4 steps. It comes from Nick Petrie. He's a leadership development specialist. He's based in the US. He's a New Zealander by background. He used to work for the Centre for Creative Leadership, and he shares some really useful resources. He's got a lot of experience in this area, and all of the tools I'm sharing, I've used with myself. I've used with coachees, and I have a lot of time for his work. And he's bringing together tried and tested techniques in his white paper. I'll give you the resource or the reference at the end of this presentation. So the first step in his process is to learn how to reflect properly, to snuff out that rumination process that leads to anxiety and lower resilience. So if you did get some stressful 360-degree feedback and you're starting to ruminate on that feedback, that criticism, and it was starting to generate some negative emotions and you're going back to it and it was affecting confidence and your resilience, that's working below the line in this model. We don't want that. We want to reflect properly. So a good reflection process would be to say, okay, I'm going to sit down. I'm going to spend an hour working through my 360-degree feedback with a coach maybe. I'm going to turn it into a practical action plan that I can focus on. I'm going to put all my energy into implementing that action plan. I'm going to get rid of the 360-degree feedback report. I might physically put it in the bin as a symbolic gesture. I'm not going to go back and relive that feedback. I'm going to focus my energy on the positive actions I've identified. So that's good reflection process. So learning how to do that, having the discipline to do that, and helping others to do that is the first step. The second step in the Petrie four-step model is to recognize that being fully awake and being fully asleep is not binary. There is a gray zone in between. So Petrie makes the point that there are times in the day when we're in a kind of state of what he calls waking sleep. You probably experienced this when you've had a really tough meeting, you've gone into the second meeting, and your head is really still in the first meeting. You might be doing that now, for example. You might be partially listening to me or scrolling through your phone or something as well. So you might be a bit distracted, not present. Petrie argues that it's in this state of waking sleep when we're not fully awake that we start to ruminate. And that's when we need to snap out of it, wake up, and use some techniques to be fully present. So mindfulness techniques aim to do this, breathing exercises. One of the techniques in Nick Petrie's paper that I'll share with you is just to take a moment, and you can do this now if you like, and just identify 3 different colors in your room. You know, I'm seeing blue on the screen, brown on my desk, and pink on a highlighter on my desk. So 3 colors, 3 sounds. What are you hearing? I'm hearing the whirring of my computer. I'm hearing a bird outside, and I'm hearing my own breathing. And 3 feelings. What am I feeling? I'm sitting on a chair. I'm feeling that. I'm feeling the shirt on my sleeve, and I'm feeling my glasses on my ear. And that helps you to be really present and focused and not kind of drift off and think about past things and start to ruminate. So learning some of those techniques just to be present is part of this 4-step process. The third one, and I'm sure you've come across this before, is to focus on your things in your circle of control. So a very simple exercise you can do individually or in a team, an executive team, is to draw a circle on the whiteboard, identify the things within the circle that you can work on, and you're going to put your time and energy and effort into working on those, and you're going to let go worrying about the things outside of the circle. You're not going to spend time and energy focusing on things you can't change. So I'm sure you're familiar with that exercise, but it's a useful one. The last step in this 4-step model is to detach and put things into perspective. You might have come across a fellow called Professor Ron Hafiz from Harvard. He's the kind of thought leader in adaptive leadership, and he uses the term get on the balcony, move from the dance floor to the balcony, see the big picture, and put things into perspective. And there's some techniques we can use to do that. One technique is contrasting. So comparing the stresses that we're under, or pressures that we're under at the moment, with some other event, and to put it in perspective. A colleague of mine shared a story with me recently that really impacted me. He let me know that he was going away on an unexpected leave because a member of his family had a 5-year-old daughter who had terminal brain cancer, and they were going to Winton to see the dinosaur bones in Queensland as part of a Make-A-Wish Foundation. It's really stuck with me for weeks, this story. But when I think about the stresses I'm under, or the pressures I'm under in 2020, nothing compares to that. You know, I've got no problems compared to that. And so when I think about a comparison, this is called contrasting, to a story like that, the pressure that's on me or the stress that I've let get on me is just lightened. And I see that really life is good. I've got nothing to worry about. I shouldn't feel the stress. So that's contrasting. Gratefulness is developing some techniques to be grateful about what we've got. So in 2020, I've started the habit of just writing on my whiteboard. I actually removed it from behind me. But every day I write down 5 things I'm grateful for just to start the day, to put me in a positive mindset. So techniques like that are useful. And the last method is to reframe anxiety as excitement. So anxiety leads to stress, that reduces resilience. If we've got a bit of anxiety like I did when I was about to log on to this software, not knowing if my microphone would work or if anyone was there, just reframe it as excitement. I've got a few nerves. That's preparing me to be energetic and perform, and it's an opportunity, and it's wonderful to be asked. So reframe it in a positive way. So there's some techniques to detach, to let go, work hard on the process, but let go worrying about things we can't control, including the outcomes. I've only got a few minutes left, so I'll just wrap up. But there's three resources that my favourite top three that I'd encourage you to have a look at, including a case study on how to build a resilience program in a utility. And I wanted just to conclude with where to from here. So a few points. Firstly, if any of the tips or strategies that I've shared with you are useful to you to build your own resilience, start there, self-leadership, experiment with them, reflect. Second point is about what's your sphere of influence? Who can you help to build resilience? Who are you mentoring? Who are you leading? Maybe you can help others to learn about some of these techniques, help them to experiment, and hopefully some of them will work and be sustainable. And lastly, plan for the future. The 21st century is going to test our resilience. It's not 2020 is not a once-off. We're going to have capacity in this area in the years ahead. So we need to invest in programs, activities, initiatives to build resilience in ourselves, in our teams, in our organisations, and in our institutions. So what's your capacity to do that? Let's plan ahead. And on that note, I'll wrap up there. If you've got any questions, I'll do my best to field them, and hopefully someone can read them out to me. And if you don't have any questions, maybe you could share just a comment or a really good tip in the chat field. Peter, can you take it from here?
Sure can. Thanks very much, Andre. Fantastic presentation, and Jacinda actually asked if you could share those valuable resources, and you're onto it, so well done, thanks. I'm just having a quick look. There's a few questions that have just come through now. Adrian wants to know, is there a risk in contrasting that you can only feel better if you can find someone who feels worse rather than dealing with the reason you feel bad?
Yeah, well, I think contrasting can work in different ways. Like I could contrast to a time when I was under pressure and I survived. So I could use my own experiences to contrast as well. So it doesn't have to be an example where someone's doing it tougher than me. So I think there's different ways to do it. Like when you and I were plugging away on a PhD, for example, you know, testing our resilience, working alone for a lot of the time, you know, that we got through that, we somehow survived. Those sort of experiences we can draw on.
Fantastic. Cheryl wants to know, are you seeing the focus of government funding into mental health looking at these types of resilience concepts?
Am I seeing it? I'd have to say no. In terms of funding that trickles through to organisations that I work for. So I work for a few different universities, the International Water Centre. So I'm sure it's being channeled into other parts of the university, but in terms of helping us to build modules on how to build resilience that we can integrate into, say, leadership programs for water practitioners, I'm not seeing that. But I do see a lot of free resources. I think I mentioned I use the Headspace app on my phone, for example, if I want to do a quick breathing exercise just to relax and stay centered. So someone's paid for that, I get it for free. So there's some resources that are impacting me, but it's not flowing through to my day-to-day work.
Nigel wants to know, do you have any thoughts on social media as a cause of stress?
That's a good one, isn't it? I think everyone's different. So I certainly know of people who switch off, detach from social media as a coping strategy, especially when there's a lot of bad news flowing. And as a parent of a teenage daughter, I'm also aware of the social media and the pressures that puts on people. But for others, they find it very invigorating to be connected. But staying connected with friends and family is a strategy to build resilience. So I think it depends on the individual. But I think it's worth reflecting. You know, is social media working for me? If not, can I change it, or do I have to switch off, take a break? And recognizing that everyone's experience is different.
And the last question, Christina wants to know how much of your mindset impacts your ability to adopt these strategies.
Yeah, well, I think it's critical. Mindset is so important. Like if you just have a fixed mindset, you'll say, you know what, I was born as someone who doesn't have much resilience, so it doesn't matter what I do, I'm just stuck there. That's a fixed mindset. Obviously, I'm not encouraging that. So where if you have a growth mindset, you say, okay, well, I might have quite low levels of resilience as my baseline, but there's things I can do to grow, and I'm going to choose to do that, and I'm going to choose to put that in my professional development plan, and maybe get a mentor or a coach to help me, and I'm going to put some time and effort into that. That's a growth mindset. So mindset is fundamental. And maybe I'm a slow learner, Peter, but it's something I've learned as a leadership coach over the last 10, 11 years. It's fundamental. And if a coachee is adopting a fixed mindset, there's very little I can do as a leadership coach. So that's the starting point. Adopt the right mindset.
Andre, thank you so much for your time. A number of points have been made in the chat that the resources that you've just outlined would be very useful. So we look forward to distributing them to our members. You'd be happy to share them with us, won't you?
Absolutely. No problem.
Thank you very much.
Thanks for the opportunity.
Thank you, Andre.
Enjoy the rest of the conference.
So for our final item of the day, we have another treat. Mark Twain once said that history never repeats itself, but it does often rhyme. So what are the concordant notes of our water systems and behaviours that we need to compose in our future designs? You can tell I like music. Dr. Ruth Morgan is here to help as she speaks to us about water and the making of Australia. Now, Ruth is an environmental historian and historian of science at the Australian National University, where she is director of the Centre for Environmental History. Ruth has published widely on the climate and water histories of Australia and the British Empire. She is the author of Running Out, Water in Western Australia, and is a lead author for the Working Group 2 of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, contributing to the 6th assessment report due in 2021. I asked Ruth to present this very interesting work after I saw it recognised in the ABC's top 5 emerging thinkers and communicators in the humanities last year. So congratulations. Welcome, Ruth.
My microphone on, turn my video on. Here we are.
Well, here you are.
Hang of a standing desk that does all sorts of magical things. So thanks for having me today, Peter, and it's a real pleasure to be here to talk to the conference and to really share some of the work I've been involved with over the past few years and where I'm going, I hope. So apologies that I'm not in Melbourne at the moment. It's strange times for all of us, I think. But I would like to acknowledge the elders past and present of the Ngunnawal peoples on whose land I live and work, as well as other First Nations peoples on whose land we're meeting today, wherever we are when we're tuning into this session. So I've only been in Canberra a few months and I'm still learning about the waterways here. But I do know that they've long been an important pathway for the Ngunnawal, the Ngambri and the Ngarigu people of this region and many other Aboriginal groups who have come from as far away as Queensland for bogong moth ceremonies and feasts. Canberra's waterways used to range over the floodplain, constantly shifting and supporting a mosaic of wetlands, ponds, billabongs and swamps. Many now, though, run into erosion gullies and concrete channels that transport water as fast away as possible. Having been here for some big downpours, I'm pretty grateful for that. No flooding, which is a good thing. But from those channels that flows into the Molonglo River, the Murrumbidgee, Burrinjuck Dam, and into various irrigation channels for watering pasture, food crops and orchards. And it makes its way back to us really in the cities when we go to the supermarket. Now, following water through cities like Canberra and Melbourne helps to open our eyes, I think, to the natural processes that do shape these urban spaces, even through all the concrete and steel that we're so used to seeing. And it helps us to connect our cities to the wider world. So I suppose in this little brief overview, I'm just hopefully sparking some of the themes that I'd like to engage a little further with today, such as the role of Indigenous people and Indigenous understandings of water in the making of urban Australia, and how that's changed over the past 200 odd years. Also, the geomorphology and contours of the land and the waterways that do shape our cities and their hinterlands, and how they've been reshaped to accommodate and make way for our cities and suburbs, allowing us, I guess, to think that human life may be separate from the environment, that our cities are somehow removed from the natural world. Now, let me see if I can move my slide on this way. No, it'll be with the mouse. Okay, we're in business. So all these ideas come together to influence the ways in which we can understand how water, its use and its management, have really made the cities and our suburbs in which most Australians live. And Water in the Making of Urban Australia is actually a project that I'm working on with a team of historians around the country, thanks to the support of our respective universities and the Australian Research Council. Now, in this presentation, I want to share with you how this project came to pass and what we're doing, the kinds of approaches on which we're building and thinking with in terms of actually doing water history. What does that actually look like? And I'd like to share with you some things that we've got in the pipeline. Okay. Now, what we're doing is undertaking what we think is the first integrated and comparative historical study of the provision, use and cultures of water in Australia's 5 largest cities. So we categorise those as cities with over 1 million people, which means, unfortunately, we have had to leave out Hobart and Darwin. We're a diverse group of 6 with 2 environmental historians, 2 economic historians and 2 urban historians. And we're based in universities in Perth, Adelaide, Melbourne, Brisbane and Canberra, with a team of research assistants and a PhD student to boot. And we really are asking, how has water shaped Australian cities? What are the historical drivers that produce today's urban water systems? And how have these systems shaped and impacted human and ecological welfare? Now, even a quick thought experiment reveals, I think, the limits to our understandings of these really quite critical questions. How would our capital cities even look and function if, for instance, a large-scale centralised water supply and sewage system hadn't been developed? Perhaps apartment blocks in Sydney would have small-scale on-site water collection and recycling plants. Perhaps swimming pools, which would be rain-fed even, would probably be rare, maybe apart from in Brisbane. Composting toilets would be standard fare in Adelaide, for instance. It's just really hard to think that way, I guess, because water and sewage pipes are just everywhere, but so invisible that it really is difficult to imagine how our cities might have developed without them. Now, we're well aware that residents and water managers in all of these places in Australia have had to adapt to different environmental conditions and constraints. These cities have very different climates, from the subtropical to the Mediterranean. The amount of rain falling over each city and its catchment has varied over time, and its actual geography is influential too. These varying relationships between rainfall, surface water and groundwater in these cities gives rise to different opportunities for water source development and waterborne waste disposal, as well as to different water crises, which I'm going to come back to in a moment. Naturally, as historians, we argue that such historical knowledge really is critical at a time when the water systems of our country's largest cities are under growing pressure due to climate change and population growth. So, some background. How did we come together, I guess, to do this project? So, although we've each worked on various aspects of historical water use and water management in Australia, we hadn't really teamed together before until we joined forces under the big umbrella of the CRC for Water Sensitive Cities, which I'm sure needs no introduction to a group like this. And this is the cover of our contribution, I should say, a report for industry partners on water histories of Brisbane, Melbourne and Perth. They were the 3 key node cities at the time when we started in 2012, and I know it's developed significantly since then, but we really focused on those 3 cities there. And it formed, I guess, the basis for what then has now come to be this Australian Research Council project that we're doing together. Now, Peter gave a very generous introduction, and I just wanted to give you a little bit of an idea of where I've come to be involved in this. And I hail from Perth, which might not be a surprise given that I've worked on Western Australia's water history, and I was studying at UWA. And it was back in 2005, really, that I really began to think about water, I guess, in our Australian cities. I'd always taken it for granted, as so many of us do. But it was around this time that Tim Flannery was warning that Perth would become Australia's first ghost metropolis, a city dead for want of water. And I know he's copped a lot of flack over the years for these sorts of predictions that he made back then. But I think for Perth, at least, some of those warnings have actual, credibility. And at this time, of course, Perth, the WA wheat belt, most of southern Australia, really, the Murray-Darling Basin, was in the grip of drought, and climate change was very much in the headlines. And it was during this time that I started a PhD for my sins, which became this book, Running Out, Water in Western Australia. And what I found as I wrote the PhD, trying to bring all sorts of diverse materials and stories together, was that since at least the turn of the 20th century, it really does seem as though Western Australians have been tormented by recurring fears that sooner or later they really would run out of water, that there wouldn't be enough water to sustain their visions and aspirations. And I think that anxiety has prompted support for the near continuous development of new sources, including, yes, those ambitious plans to transport water from the north of the state. And all the while, though, so many people, particularly in Perth, have maintained a profligate water culture, living beyond their environmental limits and rendering themselves really vulnerable to this sense of being on the brink of running out. But it wasn't just about water, though. As I was writing this book, I really found that it became a story about Western Australia and Western Australians, how we've come to where we are. I include myself in that, why and how things could have turned out differently. I think there's some cautionary tales there. There's also, I think, a relief that we've come so far in some ways, particularly reading about typhoid and all sorts of horrendous anecdotes about sausage meat coming out of taps, basically. That was the quality of water that people were grappling with. But I think still there's a sense that there's a long way to go. And these are the kinds of conversations that I hope this book prompts, because those conversations are, which we have about water, are also conversations about the kind of society we want to live in. And living in a continent of extremes, there really are few conversations as important. Now, since writing this book, I've had some really wonderful opportunities to explore some loose ends that I couldn't explore at the time, such as trying to haul Antarctic icebergs to southern Australia, not just Perth, but Adelaide. To shared histories of seawater desalination in Perth and San Diego in California that have culminated much more recently. But of course, I've had to put that a little bit to the side, as I had no idea how much work the IPCC work would really involve. But of course, we're not the only people that do water histories. Internationally, there is a vast literature on water history. And I suppose what we tend to see are grand narratives of history, really sweeping approaches to the past quite often that do tend to fall into two camps, usually a tale of woe, of declension, or great triumph of Western technological progress. And these are just some examples that are actually on my shelf here, not least because they really are gripping tales of humans trying to, and societies, I suppose, trying to make sense of their environment and to fill their visions for their communities. And there are similarities here, whether they're books written by journalists, archaeologists, law professors like James Saltzman, or historians. We're all taking a similar path, I suppose, to understanding water's past, trying to make conclusions really about the present as well as the future. Now in Australia, there's actually been, I suppose, surprisingly little reflection, I think, on how the past has shaped particularly our urban water systems, or how we might use this knowledge to inform present solutions to water management problems. Now, we're really lucky, though, to have an extensive literature on Australian cities, particularly individual cities, and how particular suburbs have emerged. And of course, how governments provided water to urban residents is certainly part of those stories. But they don't really provide us a coherent understanding of how water availability and scarcity has actually shaped urban structures and environments, how they've shaped suburban social experiences and living standards through different periods of population growth economic and land use changes, as well as crises like flood and drought. Now, you might be familiar with a couple of the works that are on this slide. As historians, we're always grateful for those that come before, who do the hard yards through the archives and bring together these sort of overarching narratives. Of course, Clem Lloyd's Either Drought or Plenty, and Joe Powell's work on Victoria, and he's also worked significantly on WA and Queensland. But both of those books really tend to focus on the rural sector, on big irrigation schemes, on the disputes over the Murray-Darling, these sorts of questions. But really, very little has been written on how the majority of Australians, the capital city dwellers, have shaped and been shaped by one of the nation's most defining characteristics, its relationship to fresh water. And I have Troubled Waters there, edited by the late Pat Troy back in 2008, because this is one of the few works that really does consider these urban relationships from a range of disciplines, not just history. It's a really worthwhile book. So our rationale. So we're trying to, I suppose, build a much more extensive and holistic understanding of these issues by integrating insights from cultural, economic, and environmental history, which we hope is going to speak to current and emerging problems in Australian cities. We're trying to look at urban forms, environments, and practices both within and outside homes, because so often when we talk about cities, and I've certainly worked on this myself, it's often quite domestically focused, but we're trying to bring in industry and commerce as well. And I just wanted to shed a little bit of light on these photographs here that I found in the State Library. These are such rich collections that just demonstrate how water in the suburbs was a live social and political concern throughout the 20th century. These photos were taken in the mid-1930s by the social reformer Frederick Oswald Barnett, who campaigned to abolish Melbourne slums and later became chairman of the Housing Commission of Victoria. And as these photos indicate, this sort of contrast that were in these files, access to water and the conveniences of the modern bathroom were the means of physical improvement as much as moral and socioeconomic uplift. You can see just the judgment that's going on here. Now, yes, I should thank you, Chris, for mentioning Rebecca Jones's book, Slow Catastrophes, on living with drought in Australia. It's such a fine-grained analysis of how mainly rural Australians understood and came to terms with the weather. And she has gone through all these diaries and got these really personal reflections. It's a really amazing effort because I know how much work has gone into that. So our first project, I suppose our first initiative, was to prepare this online exhibition of Australian urban water crises, which we did in collaboration with the Rachel Carson Centre for Environment and Society in Germany. Random, but mainly because a few of us have actually had fellowships with the Carson Centre, and they do have this amazing Environment and Society portal, which is perfect for these kinds of initiatives. Now, as you can see, we're inviting visitors to consider the historical relationship of water crises of various kinds to the development of urban water systems through the experience of Australia. And we wanted to choose a range of different departures from water-related business as usual, shortages to floods, pollution to drainage. So right the way through there. This is just a little bit of a screenshot, really, of what you'd see if you clicked onto the links, and you'd see city overviews and a jazzy timeline, trying to cover a wide range of events. And I don't think any of us realised how much time goes into these sorts of things when you're putting together this kind of exhibition. Now, we wanted people to think more carefully about how a crisis is framed and understood, and why it really matters. We wanted people to think about how dominant understandings of adverse events emerge in particular contexts and what responses and actors they summon. In Australia, when supplies for a city have run low, this is often not portrayed as a crisis of overconsumption or of exceeding environmental constraints, but of insufficient supply and inadequate infrastructure. So invariably, we restrict water to share what is left, those remaining supplies, with the ultimate solution often being seen to lie in expanding capacity, to extract or to make more potable water, whether that's through dams, rivers, groundwater, or more recently, desalination. Of course, when it's flooding, the crisis is generally not being discussed as one of poor urban planning creating flood vulnerability in particular areas, but rather raised as an inadequate provision for floodwater controls. So again, this turn to infrastructure. And it's not to say that these proposed solutions haven't served us well. I mean, particularly when we look back at, say, the photographs from Melbourne slums, or when we're thinking about typhoid, for instance, they certainly have worked really well to provide sufficient water to prevent flooding and to prevent disease and pollution. But as I found in Western Australia, and I think we have cases in our other cities, is that they often postpone vulnerability. They just put it off for another day, rather than offering truly sustainable solutions. Of course, these responses are also shaped by our everyday politics. And for much of the 20th century, and we still see glimpses of it now when we talk about the Bradfield scheme making a return, it's this big heroic infrastructure that is not only a means to address specific water problems, but it's a real symbol of technological progress and environmental control, which draws admiring audiences and voters, as well as expanding water supplies and in some cases providing the means for flood mitigation. Now, historically, that's been the large dams that ring every major city, and more recently, desalination plants have taken on this mantle. And water crises have really been mainly associated with periods of rapid population growth, extreme weather events, or both. And as we now proceed further into this uncertain climate future, the challenges that face our urban water systems really will increase. We also see, as we've been putting together this project, and it certainly comes through in the exhibition, that our past decisions, which is where the history comes in, we think, is that these decisions to increase supply capacity and to construct certain infrastructure can also limit future solutions, this idea of path dependency in a way. Urban sprawl, loss of natural wetlands and aquifers, the reliance on a single source of supply has had long-term environmental consequences and raises the cost of future responses. So yes, we have water-sensitive urban design ideas, providing our water utilities with new strategies to meet the challenges of the future. But we still need to think, I think, carefully about how to build a shared sense of responsibility for water security and how to reconcile the present demands of profitability with the future sustainability in urban water systems. So this is our crowning achievement so far, and we have quite a slate of work to do. We have this project being led by our economic historians who might be familiar to you. And they're thinking in terms of how we might learn from history, the lessons from history, and we're each contributing something there. But it's always a tricky proposition, what we might learn from history. But we have seen, of course, what's at stake. For instance, after the 2009 Victorian bushfires, we really got a sense of how the lessons of 1939, for instance, had been forgotten. The recognition of this fact, there's been, I think, a more informed approach to bushfire response and management in recent years. And I think over the past summer, of course, has prompted even further reflection in that regard, particularly in a warming world. But unfortunately, current debates and planning so often proceed largely without history, and there are valuable opportunities for learning that just don't get heard. So in the case studies that we explore here, we're showing alternatives and past responses, as well as the path-dependent problems that have arisen from our past responses. Now, we're also working on a special issue for the journal Australian Historical Studies, which continues this comparative approach, whether it's wetlands, fountains, dams, or urban development. And there's some familiar fare here, as well as trying to broaden the scope of what is usually considered in our urban water histories, from beyond the home to, as I mentioned earlier, to industry, commerce, and recreational water uses, or civic water, as my colleague Andrea Gaynor discusses. Now, last but not least, we're teaming up to co-author what is said to be a mighty book, where we're trying to co-author, all 6 of us, this rather death-defying undertaking of writing the first comparative and integrated history of water and the making of urban Australia. Now, Dorothea Mackellar's 1908 poem, My Country, I love a sunburnt country, a land of sweeping plains, of ragged mountain ranges, of droughts and flooding plains, was written in London as the homesick author recalled her life in rural Australia. And we've taken sunburnt country as part of our title because droughts and flooding rains really are the essence of urban water management challenges in Australia. Back in Mackellar's time, just after Federation, 55% of Australians lived in cities and towns, many of which were vulnerable to the extremes of too little water or too much. The 5 mainland capitals alone were home to 1 in 3 Australians. And now that's 2 in 3. So a massive change over the past 100 or so years. Now, this book is going to open with a reflection on the role of water in the foundation and siting of our 5 cities, and how these lands and waters had been shaped for generations by Aboriginal peoples. And we're keen to explore how those ideas and how the presence of Aboriginal people in our cities has changed and also shaped urban water since colonisation. And from this early urban form, we're tracing the development of the networked cities of the mid to late 19th century in response to public health problems and flood events. And we chart the rise of publicly owned centralised water systems that tried to keep up with population growth and industrial demand as rapid suburban expansion took off. And you might recall, for instance, from my title slide, I might see if I can whiz back quickly. Might be a bit slow on the old gizmo. Let's see if we can get back there, because this is such a lovely photo. Looked pretty tough for the people at the time. Let's just get back there. Poor old webinar jam, I'm really pushing it. Here we are, this horrendous experience for these poor women and their children, navigating what were called Melbourne's heartache or heartbreak streets, in this one in Ashburton, where suburban expansion had outstripped the government's capacity to provide services. And so in these sorts of places, not only in Melbourne, but in other parts of Australia, residents of the suburbs were working together to drain the streets and to try and keep up with all the pressures around them. And sanitation, of course, was often a septic tank. And it's taken a long time for government provision to catch up. And by the early 1980s, if I'll just slowly work my way back to where we were, we start to see the limits, I guess, of heroic infrastructure, whether they're financial limits or environmental limits, where there might not be any more rivers to dam, or environmental assessment is suggesting that it's unwise to dam those rivers. Of course, also the cost involved starts to become questioned. And this is part of the wider impact, I guess, of neoliberal principles taking effect as well. And finally, we turn to the millennium drought and the drying trend in southwestern Australia, with the turn to desalination and tough demand management measures. So I'd like to return to the idea of the city as part of the natural world, to see the city as a lie, as a geographer recently wrote. They're always great with words, the geographers. And this isn't so much of a rejection of the city and its suburbs, but rather to appreciate and understand and even wonder about the places where we live. I think too often we only realise the relationship between the city and the wider world when things go wrong, when there's a flood, when there's water restrictions or a boil water advisory, for instance. Thinking more carefully about water and the making of urban Australia is vital, not only to understand where we live, but how we live now and in the future. And thank you very much for having me, and for the team behind the scenes who've made this presentation possible. Thank you.
Thanks so much. That was fantastic.
Thanks.
Craig's made a comment that the photo of the boy in the sprinkler is a great reminder of what our customers have asked for. Remind us of the joy of water.
Oh.
Is that something you'd like to comment on in your work?
Absolutely. I mean, I think that's so often what we lose sometimes is that wonder and joy, particularly when we're trying to situate sort of narratives over long time spans. Those sort of individual personal moments can get lost, but I think that's where we connect, right? It's those moments of being quite intimate with our water infrastructure and all it provides. It's a really personalised way of appreciating it, and I think I hope we can capture some of those moments of fun and wonder along the way. Yeah.
Tell me, Ruth, what's something that's really surprised you in the research that you've done that you could share with us?
Oh, let me see. I think I was really surprised. I mean, maybe this is showing my age, but how when particularly, I think, when we look at how recently a lot of suburbs were sewered, for instance, with, not really until the 1970s and early 80s with big sewage funding from the federal government, allowing some of those suburbs to finally be connected. It's a bit different in Perth, where septic tanks have lasted for a while. But those sorts of things, I think, I suppose, again, it's this assumption based on the invisibility of this infrastructure that, we've got all that under control. And then you realise how recently that's come to pass. It's those sorts of things. And the other thing, of course, is the persistence of certain, I suppose, mythology or dreams about water in Australia. And Michael Cathcart's book Water Dreamers really speaks to a lot of those, of course. But how the Bradfield scheme keeps raising its head, and being in WA for most of my life, being well aware of these plans to pipe water from the north. They're heroic, they're visionary, they're amazing, but do they really hold up under close analysis? But they can still continue to be so popular.
And final question from me is, what would you like to think may change in the next 100 years in terms of our practices?
Ooh, that's a tricky one. Always hard putting the historian in the fortune teller's seat. I think perhaps it's that tricky one, of course, because we have benefited so greatly from handing over the responsibility, I suppose, of water collection and sanitation to other people. And that's one of the joys of modern life, really, that we don't have to deal with that sort of thing. But perhaps given our changing cities and the pressures on them, to see some of these smaller alternatives explored. And certainly we know in other parts of the world that those smaller kinds of setups of water recycling are possible. It seems such a shame that we pump so much perfectly good water away because of the ick factor, that there might be some, I suppose, that we might come around to thinking a bit more carefully about those sorts of options that are available and can work. That would be really exciting, I think.
Well, thanks so much, Ruth, and congratulations on your work and your upcoming book. And I imagine it'll be published as an e-version, so it's durable. That's one of the challenges that we have with, say, watering the suburbs. They're out of print, so It's great to see it that way. All right, well, that's the end of our formal presentations. Thanks again, Ruth.
Thanks so much for having me.
Now, everyone, I'm curious if you've enjoyed today. I'm just going to briefly share some of my insights from today's sessions, and while I'm doing so, you're very welcome to use the chat function to share your insights. What did you learn? What was something that surprised you? What would you like to know more about, so we can think about that for future events? Some of the insights I'll quickly share. I was just thinking about Danielle and Billie's discussions, and there was a link, I thought, between around the transformation of the public domain that's been impacted by COVID-19, and we have a key role to play there. We need front-end loading of the stimulus, Danielle mentioned, which means shovel-ready projects. So what can we release with government support to stimulate the economy? We need to think of young people across Victoria hit hard by the pandemic, and also women, as was drawn to our attention, and what role can we play to provide them occupation and a positive future? What's our role in the response phases of rescue, recovery and rebuild outlined by Danielle? Andre shared with us 3 simple and powerful strategies to build our resilience as leaders. And certainly Ruth shared some beautiful images of people experiencing the joy of water, and that question that really had drew to our minds about where is the joy as we look to the future. Before wrapping up, I'd like to mention an important initiative of the Women in Water Directors Network. Inspired by the Male Champions of Change, the network's seeking to build a group of allies in our industry. These are male board chairs and non-exec directors who can work together to accelerate their purpose of achieving a truly diverse and equitable water sector with highly skilled and supported male and female directors that are collectively raising the bar of the boards of our water sector. So we're now seeking allies from our industry. We're not expecting a major commitment of time. It's about a mindset to support the required change. So if you're interested, please get in touch with me, Tanya Fryer, Fiona Rowland, or any of the network members for more information. Now, a great conference, of course, is built on quality presentations, running efficiently. So my sincere thanks go to all of the presenters and the facilitators of our sessions. I'd like to also acknowledge our sponsors, Vision Super, Amazon Web Services, IOTA, Ashurst and WaterAid. And I want to acknowledge the amazing work of Team VicWater. Firstly, our chair, Jo Plummer, for her ever-willing support for the conference and leading us through yesterday morning. And to my staff, Fee Boucher, our Member Experiencing Manager, for the incredible energy and innovation in driving the design and technology for this conference. Lauren Vines, our event coordinator, for the arrangements and leading the conference planning. Jo Lim, our Operations Strategic Projects Manager, for her facilitation and pulling together the governance and the diversity and inclusion streams with the support of Christina Bersani, and her beloved Tigers. Also James Cleaver, Policy and Reg Manager, for facilitating the new Environmental Laws Governance session, and Fiona Wold for keeping the back of house going with registrations. And finally, thank you, delegates, for joining us and accepting the challenge of a fully virtual conference. This afternoon, you're going to receive an evaluation form. Please complete it so that we can see what works well and what can be improved for next time. VicWater's events are not over for this year. There are a lot more events coming. So please keep a look out in the member updates, LinkedIn, and our website. I'll just have a quick look at the comments. Yes, so Jacinta said a presentation from a futurist and one on leadership is a great formula. So yes, we'll keep that in mind. Thank you. And thanks for the positive comments, everyone. Okay, so I think that's a wrap. Enjoy the rest of your day and your weekend. Thanks, everybody.